Hi, this is Krishna Iyer with the Iyer Think Tank in Delray Beach. I'm glad you could join us today. This podcast is again Masters of War, Latin America, and United States Aggression from the Cuban Revolution through the Clinton years. It's a book by Clara Nieto. So yesterday and in general, we spoke of the murderous, racist American white butchers, their campaign of terror in Latin America. We started with Cuba. We discussed Cuba, American actions of murderous butchery in Cuba, their racist murders of Hispanics, their racist tortures of Hispanics. They set a precedent of, generalized repression in Latin America so that they can murder the population. That is, without doubt, that is without question, that they did this deliberately to murder the people of Latin America. They hate Hispanic people and they wanted to murder the Hispanic people. And that was the goal of these repressive regimes. There was not one thing that was gained by all of these dictators in Chile like Augusto Pinochet, in Venezuela like Carlos Perez Jimenez, like in Dominican Republic, Rafael Trujillo, like in Brazil, Castillo Branco. None of these people did anything positive for the people. They did not give them any kind of, social progress. They did not give them any kind of, uplifting of medical care. There was no standard medical care. There was no, payment. Labor unions were outlawed. There was complete disintegration from any order and democratic thought. And it was a fascist group. And that's how the gun violent white murderous butchers of the American government work. They set up torture centers all over Latin America because they have a fetish for Hispanic torture. They have a fetish for, Latin American torture. And that's what they are. They're just racist, murderous butchers of the American government. They did not do anything positive for these people. It was an economic failure, a catastrophe of the worst kind in Latin America. So we talked about Cuba. We talked about all of the things that, Jimmy Carter did on Cuba. He was a murderous anti-Hispanic butcher. He murdered so many people in El Salvador. The discussions that, Noam Chomsky give about, Jimmy Carter's, murder campaign in El Salvador and Nicaragua. He was a butcher of the worst kind. Just an absolute, human trash. That's what he was. He was human trash for the world. So basically, we're going to get started. I have the book link in the description section. Please download it so that you can get the book downloaded. I think these podcasts, I always watch my podcast twice. I think it's essential to get it with the distractions during the day. If you work during the day or there's any reason that you're unable to get it the first time, you should sit down and watch it at the end of the day. I always do. That doesn't necessarily mean you have to. I just think that downloading the book, reading the book, and watching the podcast twice is the best for complete knowledge acquisition. And that's what I do every day. And I will continue to do that every day so that I can, make sure I understand these books because they're very important. Latin America is a huge country. America, wages war all over the world. They're racist subjugators, enslavers, and murderous butchers. And that's what, that's why I read them over and over them again, because you have to understand the politics of Latin America and all of these countries. Of the politics is a huge part of understanding what's happened, because the politics of, third world countries is different than the politics of the racist, capitalist, colonialist of the West. So you have to understand the difference and what their attitude is and what their, racial purity, all of the different things that go into American colonialism is essential to understand. So let's get started. Please download the Google Drive link in the description section. Today we discussed the racist white American anti-Hispanic butchers with a fetish for Latin American torture that kept the people of Latin America in a state of abject poverty, with highly repressive and dictatorial non-democratic governments that murdered frequently and failed completely in improving the social conditions and well-being of the Latin American masses. The racist whites of Washington gave free torture technology to the military dictatorships in Latin America to provide them with hardware to torture Hispanics against the country's laws. The U.S. white racist government has a fetish for Hispanic torture and displayed wholeheartedly during the national security doctrines in Latin American dictatorships, which has been widely documented. They supplied electrocution and drowning hardware, as well as amputation machetes and all sorts of torture paraphernalia that the racist white murderous butchers of the United States used to enforce racist subjugation, slavery, and oppression in their colonized lands of Latin America. The murderous racist American butchers deny their supply of torture technology and their fetish of Hispanic torture, but it is well documented and clear in numerous studies by scholars. We discuss Cuba and the racist white murderous American butchers' pro-South African attack on Angola for racist enslavement of African blacks. We also discuss Cuba's victory, called Playa Africa. We discuss the United States' relations with Cuba and the murderous butcher of National Security Advisor to President Carter, Brzezinski, who fabricated evidence. Finally, we talk about the Mariel boat people who were encouraged to come to the United States by Carter, but when they arrived, they were tortured and imprisoned in INS prisons, and many were murdered. This is the typical action of the racist, murderous white American butchers, anti-Hispanic butchers with a fetish for torture and racist, anti-Hispanic and black butchers. So let's get started. We're gonna, get started. Glad you could join us today. We will have a long day today. I'm gonna have a long presentation today because it's, very. It's going to be very long, and we need to, make sure that we get all of the different, parts to the chapter. So please bear with me. It's going to go 3 hours, I'm sure, but hopefully it'll, maybe be done. So we're starting with the Wars Within, page 251. So let's get to page 251, and the Kingdom of the Disappear. George Jorge Videla, 1976 to 1981, commander-in-chief of the Argentine army, took power with tanks and machine guns. He announced the end of one historical cycle and the beginning of another. In effect, it was the end of what was left of democracy, and with all his liberties, the word implied, and the beginning of a long period of neo-fascist military dictatorships based on the national security doctrine, which unleashed the most widespread and most brutal dirty war. Videla engaged in an internal war against the insurgent movements and the left. He ignored the Constitution, closed Congress, rid the governments of every trace of Peronism, disbanded the unions, and abolished the CGT. Videla published strikes, restricted public liberties, closed newspapers, imprisoned scores of journalists, all while clandestine gangs murdered and disappeared thousands of internal enemies. Videla did not respect the church. The assassination of priests, seminarians, and nuns alarmed the Pope and the Argentine Conference of Bishops. They begged him to do something to stop the rash of crimes against the servants of God and his church. Countless murdered corpses appeared on the Uruguayan banks of the Plata River with their heads tied behind their backs, their fingernails gone. Emilio Magnon, Vice Minister of Education in Lanús's government, was one of the first people to accuse the dictatorship of serious violations of human rights. In an open letter, he denounced the arrest of his daughter Monica by clandestine Navy commandos and the abduction of 2 Catholic priests and 15 seminarians. The Navy Mechanic School was the regime's principal torture center. In September, officers of the school presented Brigadier General Landaburu with his daughter corpses. She had been murdered for 5 months. When she was captured, she was carrying papers recounting the testimony of young women who had managed to escape the prison, relating the atrocities committed in the torture center. Arrests were made in widespread operations in which a large number of military, police, and security personnel took part, dressed as civilians. Hoods were put over the victims, and they were brutally beaten, and their homes looted and destroyed. These men were thieves as well as murderers. The victims were thrown into vehicles without license plates and driven off to unknown destinations. Others were captured in broad daylight on the streets or at work. All were taken to clandestine detention and torture centers from which the thousands did not emerge alive. When the military dictatorships fell, 340 of these centers were discovered. Videla filled his cabinet with military officers. Lone civilian was the economics minister, Jose Martinez de Hoz, 1976 to 1981, a member of the landholding oligarchy and a well-known figure in the banking industry. In his time, he was called the Wizard of Oz for the miracles he performed during the early years of the ministry to save the economy. After his brilliant successes came the recession of the 1980s and the crumbling of industry and important banks. After a hasty devaluation of the overvalued pesos, there was a massive exodus of speculative capital calculated at $2 billion. The foreign debt stood at more than 8.5 billion and more than 25.3 billion in 1981. The unrestrained military budget caused this hefty foreign debt. "30,000 Argentines disappeared under Videla's dictatorship. We can be certain that the dictatorship produced the greatest tragedy in our history and the most savage," wrote Ernesto Sabato, president of the National Commission on the Disappeared, CONADEP, which was created by President Raul Alfonso to investigate these crimes. The commission documented 13,000 disappearances of men, women, and children under 7. The torture was so sadistic that it drove some of those who carried it out insane. Their specialties included rape, amputations, vivisections without anesthesia, and skinning prisoners alive. A medical committee verified their serious problems when it discovered that they were also torturing their own families. The one case that received worldwide attention was the detention and torture of Jacobo Timmerman, editor and owner of the Daily La Opinion, and the confiscation of his newspaper. Timmerman supported Videla but became a victim when the paper began to denounce the disappearances and the tragedy of the mothers of the Playa del Mayo. In his best-selling book, Prisoners with No Name, Cell with No Numbers, he compared the Argentine tragedy to the Jewish Holocaust. His case was very controversial. Not everyone believed that his position toward the dictatorships was honorable and courageous. In 1980, at a gathering of the Inter-American Press Society, or IPS, in San Diego, California, Maximo Gainza, owner of the Buenos Aires daily La Prensa, said that he did not understand why Timmerman called the military government fascist when he had their support. Only Videla's government was fascist, Timmerman replied. The continued denunciations of the brutality of the Argentine regime by national and international human rights organizations and the foreign press worried Videla, since they damaged the country's image and could hamper the negotiations on the swollen Argentine foreign debt with the European and United States financial centers. The military accused the Montoneros and ERP of being responsible for the country's bad press and of waging an anti-patriotic campaign against the country. President Carter and the United States Congress suspended arms sales and military aid as sanctions for the regime's grave human rights violations. The military junta saw this as meddling in the country's internal affairs, and at the first opportunity, they returned the blow. As a matter of fact, when Carter decreed a wheat embargo against the Soviet Union in 1980 in retaliation for its invasion of Afghanistan, Argentina sold its own wheat to the Soviets. The trade was mutually advantageous and paved the way for the two countries to move closer. They exchanged military and commercial missions, and their trade increased. The growing relationship between Argentina and the Soviet Union became a political failure for Carter. Argentina rejected the OAS's accusation on human rights violations and threatened to withdraw from the organization if it continued this campaign. Nevertheless, the General Assembly adopted a resolution calling for respect for human rights and repeating the denunciations of the disappearances the illegal methods used in making arrests, and the lack of information on such arrests. Shortly before the changeover in the Casa Rosada, prominent leaders of the organizations in defense of human rights were arrested, and their headquarters and homes were ransacked and razed. 64 relatives of the disappeared were also detained. By 1981, Videla's last year in office, the guerrilla movements had been practically wiped out. Maria Santuccio, leader of the ERP, was dead. Mario Firmenich, a Montenegro leader, was in exile in Italy. And the guerrillas, who were neither exiled nor lying in their graves, were rotting in prisons. Those seeking refuge in other countries were not safe. They could be captured by Argentine security forces. Through an international network of intelligence services, the Condor Plan, the dictatorships from the southern cone, Paraguay and Bolivia, pursued and eliminated their opponents, supposed guerrillas, communists and leftists. The assassination of Chilean Uruguayan personalities in Buenos Aires, Washington, and Rome were the handiwork of this network. Under Videla, Argentina became the kingdom of the disappeared, quote unquote. Every Thursday, the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo marched in silence outside the Casa Rosada, asking for their children to be returned to them alive. Argentina was also bankrupt. 50 banks had failed. The nation's foreign debt was 25 billion, and the Argentine peso was worthless. Without fanfare, but with an impressive military display before the diplomatic corps and special guests, Videla handed the reins over to the General Roberto Viola on March 29, 1981. By decision of the High Command, and the transfer of power occurred without incident. The two men were friends. They had been colleagues since their days at the military academy, and they were comrades in arms. Military circles considered them moderates. The country was on the verge of economic collapse with dangerous social problems, but it was again on the way to closer relations with the United States. Ronald Reagan had arrived at the White House 2 months earlier and was already seeking closer ties with the Argentine thugs. Before he took power, Viola went to Washington and spoke privately for an hour with the president, Secretary of State Alexander Haig, and Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger. He also met with several congressmen on Capitol Hill. He returned home full of plans and promises. Reagan needed Argentina for his military operations in Central America. Besides, it was a key country of the United States plans for hemispheric security in the projected South Atlantic Treaty Organization, SATO, similar to NATO, comprising the countries of the Southern Cone and South Africa. Reagan asked Congress to lift Carter's embargo on arms sales to Argentina and immediately sent military and commercial missions in Buenos Aires. The Argentine military agreed to cooperate in the clandestine CIA operation against Nicaragua. Its task was to train the mercenary Nicaraguan terrorist forces, the Contra, and the Salvadoran army facing a civil war in counterinsurgency techniques. The White House assigned $10 million annually to this end. Though the country was on the verge of bankruptcy, Viola continued to spend exorbitant amounts on weapons. Repression was extremely harsh. There was corruption in the government, and for the first time, hungry people were begging in the streets. Consumer prices skyrocketed. The banks refused to lend money for longer than a month. Unemployment stood at 12%. Inflation spun out of control, and the foreign debt reached $30 billion. The unions threatened a general strike, and as in the old days. The military worried that Viola would not be able to control this crisis, and his plans for openings and democratization and his easy manner with the Peronists bothered his fellow officers. The release of Isabel Martinez de Peron, he allowed her to go into exile in Spain, was the last straw. In June 1982, General Furtado Leopoldo Galtieri forced Viola to resign, declaring that the country's bad economic situation demanded that such a measure be taken, and put on the presidential sash himself. No one was surprised. 5 weeks before this mini coup, Galtieri went to Washington to hold talks with prominent high government officials. It was said that he offered the military bases to Patagonia in exchange for investments in a new natural gas pipeline and in the oil industry. He offered to continue Argentina's support for the CIA's Central American operations. Gabriel wanted to be closer to the people and offered popular asados barbecues in the province the people called his government program, the Great National Barbecue. The economic picture worsened. The recession and inflation indexes hit a world record. In a single year, the Argentine peso went from 2,000 to 12,000 to the dollar. The budget deficit reached $2.6 billion in the middle of the 1982 the foreign debt had risen to 35 billion. Under Viola, it rose to 8 billion. To divert attention from the economic disaster, Galtieri dusted off the conflict with Chile over the Beagle Channel. As this ploy did not succeed in raising national spirits, he received the conflicts with Great Britain over the Malvinas or Falkland Islands, to which Argentina claimed sovereignty. He launched a campaign with nationwide repercussions with the slogan, "The Malvinas are Argentina's." The people, led by Nobel Prize winner Adolfo Perez Esquivel, chanted a reply, "So are the disappeared." The general's secret plan for a surprise invasion of the islands on a memorable historical date is a symbolic gesture of Argentine heroism. But the people, already weighed down by the economic situation, protested even more vigorously. Housewives against the high cost of living and the rise in taxes, unions against the lamentable state of the economy, and human rights movements against official violence. One of the largest and angriest protest demonstrations took place on March 23rd. The people chanted the refrain, "Siva acabar la dictadura militar." It's going to end. The military dictatorship is going to end. Galtieri decided to launch the invasion immediately. The ugly little war. In 1966, the United States General Assembly, with the full support of Latin America, recognized Argentina's sovereignty over the Malvinas Island, taken by force by Great Britain in 1833. The British government ignored this recognition. Tensions rose in March 1982 when a group of Argentines disembarked on San Pedro Island in the Georgina del Sur archipelago to dismantle a whale processing factory and to raise their national flag. In response, the islanders attacked the offices of an Argentine airline and raised the British flag. The British government delivered a complaint to the Argentine government and asked the support of its allies. Ronald Reagan telephoned Galtieri and warned that an attack on the islands would have grave consequences. Argentina would be accused of being the aggressor, quote unquote, and sanctions would be imposed. He offered to send Vice President George Bush. Galtieri would not receive him unless he was prepared to deal with the question of sovereignty. Besides, the invasion was already underway, a fact of which he did not inform Reagan. In fact, on April 2nd, Argentine forces recaptured the Malvinas Island, overpowered all 49 British Marines, and together with the governor of the islands, took them to Montevideo. Argentina made General Mario Menendez governor, renamed Port Stanley the capital. Puerto Argentina raised its blue and white flag and sent military reinforcements, putting them on maximum alert. No one was going to displace them. The British Foreign Secretary, Lord Peter Carrington, pronounced the situation potentially dangerous. British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher was not about to tolerate a situation in which a disgraced Latin American dictatorship offended the United Kingdom, and she prepared to dispatch the British Navy to the South Atlantic. For both countries, the conflicts became a question of national honor and life and death for their battered governments. The Argentine public vigorously supported the invasion. For Thatcher, the invasion brought many problems. It had surprised British intelligence services and the Americans as well. When the Labour Party asked for her resignation, the Iron Lady confronted the Parliament, making it clear that she would not resign. Now is the time for strength and resolution, she declared firmly. She severed relations with Argentina, froze its assets in Great Britain, prohibited the importation of Argentine products, and succeeded in obtaining the somewhat reluctant support of the European Economic Community. Heads began to roll in London, burdened with the humiliation suffered by the United Kingdom. Without his having foreseen it, Lord Carrington resigned, and Francis Pym became the new Foreign Secretary. Defense Secretary John Knott also tendered his resignation, but the Prime Minister did not accept it. The British government condemned the flagrant aggression, demanded the immediate withdrawal of the Argentine forces, and set April 5th as the deadline, but it continued to seek a negotiated solution. If this did not succeed, Britain would dispatch a naval war fleet to the Falklands. The United Nations Security Council supported Great Britain. One resolution called for the cessation of hostilities, the unconditional withdrawal of Argentine forces, and the search for a diplomatic solution respecting the islanders' self-determination. Panama, a non-permanent member of the Council, was the only nation to vote against the resolution. On April 5th, the British fleet weighed anchor for the South Atlantic with 40 warships, 2 aircraft carriers, planes, helicopters, a flotilla of light tankers, 25,000 men, and a battalion of Gurkhas, Nepalese mercenaries known for their extreme cruelty. Nort announced the blockade of the islands for 200 miles in all directions. Any Argentine ship that entered the zone would be attacked. The same day, united for victory, members of the Argentine government, opposition figures, Peronist union leaders, the military and intellectuals all traveled to the Malvinas on a charter flight to attend the inauguration of Governor Menendez. Caught in the conflict between the two military alliances, NATO and the Rio Treaty, the Inter-American Treaty of Reciprocal Assistance, Reagan spoke of neutrality. His Secretary of State, Alexander Haig, made lightning trips between Washington, London, and Buenos Aires in an effort to mediate. He demanded that Argentina comply with the United Nations resolution on withdrawal of its forces and proposed that Argentina, Great Britain, and the United States share the government of the islands. Galtieri did not accept the proposal since it did not guarantee Argentine sovereignty. Haig is not a mediator, but a British ally, he commented. Failing to reach an agreement, Haig announced that his mission of mediation was over. On April 30th, Reagan announced his unconditional support for Great Britain, accused Argentina of aggression, quote unquote, imposed severe economic and commercial sanctions, and suspended military aid. And Argentina accused Reagan of betrayal, causing irreparable damage to hemispheric relations and dealing a fatal blow to the inter-American system. Haig's gestures of mediation served as a smokescreen to hide the aid the United States was already sending to Britain, dealing it a winning hand, satellite intelligence, logistic support, and tons of weaponry, including 200 Sidewinder missiles whose precision was almost infallible. The transfer was made on the high seas and on the Ascension Land, an Anglo-American military fortification in the middle of the Atlantic. News agencies reported that the Soviet Union moved a satellite over the South Atlantic to provide Argentina with intelligence information. From every corner of the continent came harsh criticism of the United States for turning its back on Latin America and failing to meet its obligations as a member of the Rio Treaty. Furthermore, the governments of Brazil, Cuba, Peru, and Venezuela offered Argentina military assistance. With the British Armada advancing towards South Atlantic, Argentina requested an urgent meeting of the OAS, consultative body under the Rio Treaty, which called for a collective action when one of its members was attacked. A week later, the war was already underway. OAS approved a resolution condemning Great Britain for the quote-unquote unjust and disproportionate armed attack and asked the United States to lift the economic and military sanctions it had imposed on Argentina. The resolution was approved by a vote of 17 in favor, 0 against, and 4 abstentions. The United States, Chile, Colombia, and Trinidad and Tobago. In a virulent speech, the Argentine Chancellor, Nicanor Costa Mendez, accused the United States of giving illegal and repugnant, quote-unquote, aid to Great Britain. He was fervently applauded. And in May, in the midst of the war, the Coordination Office of the Non-Aligned Nations in Havana, with Chancellor Costa Mendez's participation, gave Argentina its fullest support. Javier Perez de Cuellar, the United Nations Secretary General, proposed an interim government by several countries under the United Nations flag. Colombia was the only Latin American country that did not stand by Argentina. When the latter called for the meeting of the consultative body of the OAS, invoking the Rio Treaty to raise the issue of British aggression. Colombia abstained. Ambassador Carlos Bernal stated that his government had doubts about the application of the treaty in this case, since the United Nations was already dealing with the issue. He added that the OAS must not ignore the United Nations request for withdrawal of Argentine troops and act on the issue, since this would create a serious precedent that could weaken the United Nations and result in serious crisis. He appeared to ignore the fact that the two organizations repeatedly acted simultaneously on the matters that threatened peace. Colombia also abstained from the resolution condemning Great Britain, alleging that it was rejecting the use of force. Colombia was criticized for breaking continent-wide unity. In Argentina, Colombia earned the title of the Cane of the Americas, and it was the subject of protests outside its embassy in Buenos Aires and a boycott of its products. In Colombia, the government position was met with feelings of frustration and shame. The former Chancellor Alfredo Vasquez Carrizosa declared that denying Argentina's rights was a terrible precedent, and he referred in two contradictory letters from President Turbe Ayala to Galtieri. In one, Turbe expressed full support. He did not criticize the use of force. And in the other, he said, without mentioning the invasion, that he could not support the steps that Galtieri had taken. Isolated but powerful Colombian voices supported the government's position, and Turbe received congratulatory messages from President Reagan and Mrs. Thatcher. The Colombian position was political, not juridical, as the government claimed, since there was no legal basis for denying Argentina its right to call a meeting of the consultative body under the provisions of the Rio Treaty whenever it was in danger. To do so was to prejudge the contents of its complaint. A Peruvian, Bustamante y Rivera, who was the former president of the International Court of Justice, upheld Argentina's right of recourse to the Rio Treaty. On April 11, 1982, the British fleet undertook the so-called reconquest of the Falkland Islands. Troops landed in Georgia del Sur, and again the British flag was raised. The first stage of the war was received with jubilant, almost delirious approval by the British government and people, and Maggie, quote unquote, obtained a stunning victory in the English and Scots municipal elections. Buenos Aires was furious. Thousands of people congregated outside the Casa Rosada, shouting slogans against Great Britain and Galtieri's dictatorship. In Caracas, demonstrators burned the British and United States flags. Manipulation of public opinion was easy for the Argentine dictatorship. It kept patriotic fervor high by means of public statements. It reported that its military forces were advancing from one victory to the next. Some newspapers, under bold headlines, announced that Argentina was winning the war. In May 1982, in the midst of the war and the patriots and triumphant euphoria, Galtieri organized a rock festival, which was some 60,000 people attended. When the Patagonian singer Leon Gieco began his famous song Underground with the lines, "All I ask of God is that war is not indifferent to me," the festival turned into a revolt against the dictatorship. The young people asked for peace, and thousands confronted the police and infuriated the military by chanting, "It's going to end. The military dictatorship is going to end." Pope John Paul II had wanted to mediate avoidance of the war. Before it started, he asked both governments to suspend hostilities, but Mrs. Thatcher replied that she would proceed since she would not allow aggression to triumph. International law must be defended, and the freedom of the Falkland inhabitants must be respected. The Pope traveled to London in June. It was one of the most controversial of his pilgrimages to build bridges against the Anglican Church. The Vatican explained that this trip had been scheduled before the conflict erupted. The Pope did not want his presence in London to be seen as supporting Great Britain. From there, he announced a trip to Buenos Aires. During the 30 short hours he remained on Argentine territory, there was violent combat in the southern waters, during which ships were sunk, planes were shot down, and close to 1,000 were left dead. When he boarded his plane to return to Rome, the British troops were advancing on Port Stanley. 2 days later, Argentina surrendered. The nationwide astonishment rose to a climax when Galtieri announced the defeat. More than 11,000 soldiers, many of them adolescents, surrendered. It was a stunning and ignominious defeat. In a brief and sober ceremony in Port Stanley, General Menendez signed the Act of Surrender in which he crossed out the word unconditional as written by the British. Thousands were taken prisoner of war and several officers were taken to London to be interrogated. The humiliation could not have been deeper. In Buenos Aires, there were violent riots and the people confronted the police. Scores were wounded on both sides. Galtieri was prevented from speaking from the Casa Rosada balcony by the whistles and jeers of the multitude. He spoke on television instead. There will be no final peace if Britain keeps the islands, he said. In the protest demonstration, there were more chants against the United States for its betrayal than there were against Great Britain, the aggressor. The masses demanded an immediate trial of the junta members. They should answer for the defeat and the thousands who had died in the war. Costa Mendez resigned. Raul Alfonso, the leader of the Union Cívica Radical Civil Union, UCR, the party that was second only to Peronism, asked for the immediate recognition of the military junta so that we can begin to take the road to democracy. Great Britain suffered many losses. The Argentine Air Force sunk its Navy's most modern warship, a troop transport, a destroyer, and two powerful modern frigates, damaged one destroyer, wrecked another, and shot down 5 jets. Argentina lost half of its planes and a large number of irreplaceable pilots. The British Navy sank the Argentine ship General Beltrano, its only cruiser, with 1,042 men on board. Argentina claimed to have rescued nearly 800. Argentina accused Great Britain of attacking the ship outside the 200-mile exclusion zone, and the act was condemned throughout Latin America. The loss of so many lives in this absurd war profoundly shook the world. Great Britain claimed that it had been waged a war of legitimate defense. The Argentine Navy hugged the coast in fear of British nuclear submarines. Some 2,000 young Argentines died. The cost of the war was estimated at more than $2 billion. The Argentine military lost its most precious remaining quality, military prestige. The diplomatic suit that Argentina was winning in the United Nations was gone. In mid-July, under strict security measures, the last 593 soldiers captured by Britain arrived in Buenos Aires. The military authorities prevented the media from getting close to them. The resentment of these young people, victims of the dictatorship and war, was profound. They arrived not as heroes, but as renegades. Some of them tried to commit suicide. The alienated youth was the greatest price of the war, irresponsibly taken by the dictatorship for dubious political gain. So we're going to make some comments. So mainly the Argentine war, the ugly little war. This is, clear. The white, racist, murderous butchers of Great Britain and the United States waged an illegal war on Argentina's Falkland Islands. They were, universally condemned for having illegally occupied the Falkland Islands. Britain had no business being in the Falkland Islands. And you can see the racist butchers of the United States. They're supposed to support the Latin American dictatorships. They are introducing their capitalism in this place. They supported their white friends in Europe. It's a fascist group of murderous butchers. We see over and over, all of the information indicates that the United States was in the wrong. They did not follow normal, regular world rules. They backed Great Britain in this war when the whole Latin America said America is at fault. America is breaking the law. The OAS is the Organization of Latin America. If the OAS sides with Argentina, the United States has to side with Argentina. That is the rule. That is why these are scraps of paper. Any organization run by the United States is a scrap of garbage paper. And that's what this is. This is a garbage paper that the U.S. government run. The OAS that they created, they did not even follow their dictums, which is you tell Britain to get out of the Falkland Islands. That was the key. All of the dictatorships, all of the military groups in Latin America back Argentina. Washington should know such thing, that they waged a racist war and supplied Britain with the racist weaponry to win this war against Argentina, a fact for which they will go down as a prestige vacuum, a racist group of murderous white butchers. So continuing on, the Colombian, basically, the bottom line is that the U.S. government and Britain, they're white supremacists, are, out of control in many instances. They create organizations, they make it garbage. The UN condemned this. But aside from that, all of these organizations are meant for, proper conduct. And the United States and Great Britain fail to appreciate the proper conduct in this case. Again, these are warmonger states. These are warmonger, imperialist, murderous butchers. And that is what they go down. President Reagan, his support of Margaret Thatcher is the most silly, hypocritical example of American deceit and fraud. He was a hypocrite. He sent Haig to Argentina to discuss the matter while he was giving Britain hundreds and millions of dollars of weapons to fight this war. So America, again, a racist group of murderous butchers. And then we talked about Carter, Jimmy Carter, Carter and the problems in Latin America, the human rights. So where were these torture centers coming from? The torture centers were coming from the United States. The CIA does the torture. It gets adequate funding from the U.S. Congress. Large amounts of money go into torture. They give it to Argentina. And then the president comes out and says, we're going to cut off aid. We're going to cut off funding. What is the purpose in that? What is the only purpose in that is hypocrisy, deceit, and fraud. The U.S. government is a deceitful group of white murderous butchers and fraud liars. That's what ultimately it is. So let's, continue. We're going to finish the epilogue to a horror story. This is, again, regarding the Falklands War and the United States aggression and Britain's racist aggression, American and British racist aggression against Argentina. Epilogue to a horror story. The Malvinas Falklands was the ugly little war, the ridiculous war as the American press dubbed it, the absurd and sloppy war as the Prize-winning Colombian writer Gabriel Garcia Marquez called it, was something more than a story of a humiliating military and political defeat for Argentina. It was more than a British victory. It was a game of power, a story of changing and unthinkable alliances of Western loyalties and hemispheric disloyalties. It was evidence of a world irremediably divided between North and South, the scene of non-existent third world solidarity, of fragile European unity, of Latin American incapacity to unite in political struggle and to respond immediately and adequately to the arbitrary imposition of the great racist powers. It was further a display of American arrogance toward the southern continent, and was on one more occasion when the United Nations, where great power interests were paramount, demonstrated its incapacity to avoid conflict and prevent war. It was also one more piece of evidence that the voice of the OAS was no more than a leaf in the wind, or what we said, a garbage dumpster paper, a scrap paper. The absurd and sloppy war in which more than 2,000 Argentines and hundreds of British died, which ruined Argentina and strangled Britain's economy. This unholy war with which a disgraced dictatorship attempted to wipe out its record of ineptitude, corruption, and violence was, for the masters of war, a platform for their war games. The South Atlantic had served as a laboratory for sophisticated weaponry, not yet traded on the arms markets, and the first war of microchips and computers, faster than the human brain, wrote time. The war became merely a sad chapter in Argentina's history. High British and United States officials who played an important part in the conflict confirmed that the United States' aid to Britain was so broad to have divulged it would have been shattering, since it would have shown the weakness of Britain's defense. The lion rampant, the emblem of the United Kingdom, had no teeth. Without United States help, Great Britain would have been defeated. Would have been defeated, affirmed United States Secretary of State of the Navy, John Lehman. And a curious detail, the Pentagon provided Britain with an extremely useful little book, confessed a high British official, with its evaluation of Argentine military tactics, particularly its submarines, obtained in joint military maneuvers. The Argentine military never imagined that the Pentagon would give it to its enemies, quote unquote, to use against Argentina, quote unquote. Had Reagan irreparably damaged United States relations with Latin America, as so many claim, question mark? We should not take this question lightly, but in 6 months it will be forgotten, remarked a high United States official. Reagan wrote personal letters to several Latin American presidents. He declared that although I understand the frustrations of Argentina, the United States had to support the principle of avoiding force in resolving disputes. Some might have been surprised or perhaps indignant at his cynicism. Contrary to world opinion, his love of force was exposed in his unholy wars in Central America. This war was also the beginning for the national security doctrine, military regimes in Argentina, and the single favorable result. The people were indignant at having been deceived. They were humiliated by the defeat. They grieved for the sacrifice of thousands of the youth in the Malvinas, and they were furious at the prolongation of the military's dirty war in which tens of thousands of Argentines were killed or disappeared. They resolved to put an end to the military presence in the Casa Rosada. They demanded the justice, wanting those responsible for both tragedies to be brought before civil courts. 3 days after the surrender, Galtieri was forced to resign, and the commanders of the three service branches were relieved of their duties. The government of the retired General Reynaldo Bignon, who replaced Galtieri, was transitional. Suits and ties began to appear in the Casa Rosada and at the highest levels of government. Bignon's cabinet was composed of 9 civilians and 1 military officer, the Minister of the Interior. During the year and a half that he occupied the presidential seat, June 1982 to December 1983, Bignon paved the way for a return to democracy as the people demanded. The past began to be stripped of its cover. Soon denunciations for murders and disappearances started to shower the armed forces, the security force services, and the police as the perpetrators of these crimes. The remains of the disappeared began to appear, buried as N no name in mass graves. The government assured everyone that these were the corpses of beggars and indigent. It could not explain why there were bullets from coup de graces in their skulls and traces of torture on their bodies. The hardliners in the armed forces were not in agreement with Bignon's opening actions, nor with the surrender of power. They wanted to impose conditions before the election to assure their constitutional presence in the civilian government and to bury the investigations and trials coming their way under the law of amnesty. Rumors of a coup were rife. The dirty war continued. Ultra-right underground groups connected to sectors of the military carried out terrorist acts, sabotage, abductions, and assassinations of politicians and popular and leftist leaders, and even military officers who favored Bignon. These acts created a tension that could spoil the election and the transition to democracy. A month before the vote, the military junta decreed the law of amnesty, which it called an act of national pacification. After almost a decade of the dirty war, the military wanted to make clear that what had happened was an internal war against subversion. The armed forces, in fulfilling their duty, prevent the destruction of the republic and its institutions. With this law, these men placed themselves beyond the reach of the courts. The investigations of human rights abuses, verdicts on the responsibility for the Malvinas War, corruption probes, and explanations of the enormous national debt, which reached $43 billion as a result of multi-million-dollar weapons purchases. The amnesty law was met with national revolution. Large protest marches led by Nobel Prize winner Perez Esquivel and the mothers and grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo showed the military leaders that they would not allow such a law. The two presidential candidates, Raul Alfonso of the UCR and Italo Luder, a Peronist of the right, promised to repeal it. But so great was the fear that the military might not hand over power or would postpone the election that when the two most powerful union groups called for a general strike a few days before the elections, the daily La Nacion termed it a collective suicide. They should not tempt the men in uniform, Alfonso and the military caste. Raul Alfonso, leader of the Union Civic Radical, a center-left party, was elected president of Argentina with 52% of the vote. It was the first electoral defeat for Peronism. We have won, but we have defeated no one. This is a victory for Argentina. Alfonso announced the enthusiastic crowd. He entered the Casa Rosada through the front door with immense popular support based on his charisma and honesty, his honest and courageous stance toward the military, and his promises to see justice done and bring the officers before the civilian courts. The country was on the verge of bankruptcy, and the people were traumatized and demoralized by the political violence and the humiliating defeat in the Malvinas. Economic indices were catastrophic. Recession, the annual inflation rate of 1,000% 1982, 15% unemployment, a foreign debt of 43 billion, the largest, third largest in the world, and a lack of foreign currency. There was panic because of successive bankruptcies of banks, financial institutions, and industrial enterprises. The deterioration of living conditions reached intolerable levels. The Argentine peso was a vertiginous free fall. Salaries and wages were sufficient to cover the necessities of life for most people. Were insufficient. Salaries and wages were insufficient to cover the necessities of life for most people. There was a lack of housing and uncontrolled increases in rents. Some 500,000 people were forced to abandon their homes and take refuge in boarding houses, often filthy and decrepit. Alfonso was facing the monumental task of leading the country out of bankruptcy and bringing the untouchable military class to justice. The people demanded as much. Relative of the victims published lists of thousands of the disappeared and asked for justice. Mass graves and corpses were discovered in the mountains of Tucumán. Even soldiers and officers, veterans of the Malvinas War, denounced strategic and political errors committed by Galtieri and his advisors, incompetence and corruption in the army ranks, and acts of cowardice by their superiors. Confronting the military class, forcing it to give in, and bringing it to court was not an easy job, not without danger from the fragile democracy. The powerful military class considered itself an aristocracy of social origin, the excellence of its professional education in Prussian tradition, and the hegemony it had held for more than half a century. No president came to power without the previous approval of the military. Argentina in history was plagued with military presidents. They consider it their duty and right to exercise power. One of Alfonso's most serious mistakes was delaying in taking on the military immediately while it was weakened and while he enjoyed broad national support. It was a case of now or never. He should have dismantled the repressive apparatus and the intelligence units, the detention and torture centers of the three branches, restructured the military institutions, and cleaned out their ranks, which were rife with criminals and potential coup leaders. By leaving them intact, he exposed his government and the country to grave dangers. Within the days of assuming power, Alfonso authorized the trials of the 9 commanders of the military juntas, the former generals Videla, Viola, Galtieri, and Bignon, and the former admiral Emilio Massera. But he assigned this task to the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, the military's highest corps. There was harsh criticism of this measure. No one believed in the efficacy and impartiality of military justice. To correct this impression, Alfonso introduced reforms to the Code of Military Justice that gave the civilian courts power to act in cases of undue delay by the military tribunal and to civilians, and the right to appeal its sentences. Congress approved these reforms, but most of the political sectors, organizations, and human rights groups criticized them because the military could obstruct justice. Alfonso named a Commission Nacional de Personas Desesperadas, CONADEP, and appointed a writer, Ernesto Zapata, to head it. Its function was to shed light on the crimes committed against civilians by the military dictatorships during the 7 years of the quote-unquote internal war, but it was not authorized to denounce them before the courts of justice. The military demanded total amnesty from the government. They would not accept being brought before civilian courts, since their fight against subversion, according to Videla, had been a just and necessary war won by the military. He considered the prosecutions an injustice against the armed forces and a blot on the honor of the military, displaying a disrespectful and threatening manner toward the government and justice. The High Command promoted officers who were accused of serious human rights violations. The Supreme Council of the Armed Forces put to the trials of the military officers and more than 2,000 lawsuits brought by relatives of the disappeared in abeyance for 3.5 years. It did absolve the controversial naval captain Alfredo Estes, accused of 20 murders, among them 2 French nuns and a Swedish Argentine teenage girl. Alfonso demanded Estes' resignation, but the High Command did not obey the order and promoted him instead. Faced with the military tribunal's inaction, in 1985, the Federal Appeals Court in Buenos Aires initiated proceedings against the former commanders Videla and Viola and the former Admiral Massera. The trials lasted 5 months. Some thousand witnesses were heard. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse, shouted slogans against the military, and demanded that the defendants be found guilty. The court convicted Videla and Massera to life imprisonment for murder, torture, illegal arrest, and theft, and Viola to 17 years for the same crimes. Other high military officers were given lesser sentences. The court absolved Galtieri, the former Admiral Jorge Anaya, and other officers responsible for the defeat in the Malvinas. The court also convicted Generals Menendez, commander of the Argentine forces in the Malvinas, and Carlos Sandre Masson. Masson fled to the United States with false papers, but he was captured and extradited to Argentina in 1987 and sentenced to 25 years in prison for murder, abduction, arbitrary arrest, and torture for the disappearance of 171 Uruguayan citizens, 35 of whom were students. The former General Ramon Camps, a former chief of police of Buenos Aires province, considered one of the most sadistic executors of the repression, was also convicted. He was sentenced to 25 years for numerous murders, tortures, and disappearances, among that of a group of high school students. The horrendous crime was recalled in the Argentine film La Noche de los Lapices, Night of the Pencils, directed by Hector Alvaro, 1986. The Supreme Court ratified all the sentences. With contempt for the courts and as a challenge to the government's authority, former generals and admirals indicted by the tribunals refused to appear before the courts. The court ordered the arrest of 12 high Navy officers, among them the 4 retired admirals and the naval officer Alfredo Estes. Alfonso's popularity because of his weakness regarding the military and the way he managed the previous serious economic crisis, his Austral plan, a change in the currency to combat the hyperinflation, was met with violent strikes in which store windows were smashed and businesses were looted. The strikes were suppressed by the police, resulting in several deaths and many wounded. He was also criticized by the opposition parties regarding the convictions of the officials. Some pointed out the slow pace of justice. In 3 years, only 10 had been sentenced, and others thought that they should not have been tried at all, since such procedures served only to increase the nervousness in the barracks and the rail of the calm of the citizenry. The people wanted peace with the military at any cost, including their exoneration. In fact, more cases moved forward and the civilian courts convicted the officers, the more uneasiness grew in the military ranks and nervousness among the people, since they knew military had a propensity for coups. The entire country suffered anxiety at the growing military unease. Amid this great tension, Alfonso ordered that the court cases be speeded up and presented Congress with a bill, a slanted amnesty that he called national reconciliation, but the people dubbed full stop. It fixed a term of 60 days in which to summon officers accused of human rights violations once its deadline was passed. No court, civilian or military, could subpoena any member of the armed forces or police, no matter the seriousness of his crime, nor appeal of the sentences. The full stop law was the subject of a bitter national debate, rancorous confrontations of the Congress, and violent popular protests, including battles with the police, with the result that countless peoples were wounded and arrested. Political and popular sectors, human rights movements, the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, and relatives of the dirty wars victims impugned the law as unconstitutional, since it violated the principle of equality before the law, and they accused the government of covering up genocide. Nevertheless, the Chamber of Deputies and the Senate approved it by large majorities. The president signed it, and the Supreme Court of Justice declared it constitutional. It took effect on February 24th, 1987. A storm of criticism of the government, Congress, and the courts came from all sides. A group of relatives of those killed by the guerrillas objected to the fact that the government was making no moves to bring back into the country the terrorists that were freewheeling abroad. The rightist parentists supported the government. They retorted that this law and the point of departure to pacify the country. Reeling from these criticisms, Alfonso maintained that history will remember him for this law meant to bring about a reconciliation between civilians and the armed forces, and for the trials of the former commanders of the military junta. He believed that the raw nerves of the uniformed services would be soothed when they realized that this law benefited them. Such a realization did not occur, nor was there a decrease in anxiety among those in uniform. They demanded total amnesty to restore the strained honor of the armed forces. A military heart attack. With the full stop law, Alfonso gave militarism mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. From this point onward, he was faced with serious military uprisings. They began on April 15, 1987, with a rebellion by the commander of the military regiment in the province of Cordoba in support of Army Major Ernesto Barrero, who was accused of serious human rights violations. He was discharged for refusing to appear before a civilian court. The police tried to arrest him, but were unsuccessful, owing to the intervention of his fellow officers. Barrero fled. The regimental commander was accused of sedition and relieved of his duties. The mutineers surrendered. On Holy Friday, 2 days after his surrender, some 200 officers under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Aldo Rico mutinied at the Campo de Mayo, 15 miles from Buenos Aires, in support of Barrero. They appeared in combat uniform with bulletproof vests, heavily armed and with black camouflage on their faces. They demanded total amnesty for the officers involved in the revolt and the suspension of all trials of military officers. Alfonso refused, declaring a state of siege. His motto was democracy or dictatorship. The Plaza del Mayo filled with people cheering the president, and democracy was booing the military. When the president appeared before Congress with his account of the facts and declared that democracy was not negotiable, the chamber shook with applause. 500,000 people with banners and signs in the Plaza del Mayo shouted to the mutineers, "Don't you dare, don't you dare. If you dare, we'll burn down your barracks." Thousands of unarmed demonstrators attempted to gain entry to the barracks. The police tried to hold them back, but they broke through the barricades and reached the entrance, demanding the firing squad for the traitors of the motherland. The enormous and spontaneous demonstration of support for the government and for democracy, rejection of the mutineers, and the backing of the Latin American, European, and United States head of states showed that everyone within the country and abroad supported the president. On Easter Sunday, Alfonso flew by helicopter to Campo del Mayo to talk with the mutineers. An hour later, he announced their unconditional surrender. As the law requires, they will be arrested and brought to justice, he proclaimed. But the president's victory had a hidden aspect. His order to put down the Campo del Mayo rebellion had been boycotted by the commander-in-chief of the chiefs of staff, General Rios Arenu. To carry out the order, Rios Arenu called in an army corps between 1,000 and 2,000 men, quartered more than 217 miles from Buenos Aires. The convoy advanced slowly. No commanding officer will willingly suppress his comrades by force of arms. And one of the cara pintados, painted faces worn as camouflage in the Campo de Mayo, Rios Arenu, acknowledged the order but did not carry it out. President Jose Sarney of Brazil and Julio Maria Sanguinetti of Uruguay maintained permanent connection with Alfonso. They feared the effect by example of the uprisings in their own countries. Analyzing the situations in each country and assessing support for or disagreement with Alfonso's management of the military problem revived the debate in Uruguay and Brazil on the thorny topic of military injustice, with ensuing national alarm. Front page news presented Alfonso as the winner, democracy strengthened, and mutineers under control. Aldo Rico and other rebels were arrested and given discharges. A Buenos Aires newspaper trumpeted, "Everything under control." Still, the epilogue to this story was not so brilliant. Democracy stood on the shifting sands of the full stop amnesty law. The military's passivity and disobedience of the president's orders was a pathetic demonstration of the civilian government's haplessness when confronted with military power. The uprisings and chronic military anxiety led Alfonso to make more concessions. He presented to his Congress a rider to the full stop law that legitimized the concept of disobedience in the cases against the officers, those who committed human rights violations in carrying out the orders of their The superiors, under pressure or irresistible coercion, were exonerated of guilt. Some 400 of the accused officers benefited. Thievery, there was a great deal of theft at the high levels, would be punished since the orders were to kill and torture, but not to rob the property of others. In May 1987, the law of due obedience was adopted by wide majorities in the chambers of deputies and the Senate, and the Supreme Court of Justice declared it constitutional. Only one judge dissented. The law divided Argentina. Politicians, intellectuals, judges, representatives of human rights organizations, and the general population criticized the law, the Congress, and the court, and again accused the government of propitiating impunity. They pointed out that the law was unjust, arbitrary, unconstitutional, illegal, immoral, and politically misconceived, approved in a scandalous manner with pseudo juridical arguments. 99% of those responsible for the crimes committed during the dictatorship can avoid justice. The opponents to the law insisted that it converted Argentina into the first country where torture and murder were legalized. Alfonso again believed that with this law he could calm the military's extended attack of nerves. But the high military command let him know it was not enough. They persisted in their demands for total amnesty, for a political solution to the political fact, such as the war against subversion, and for moral vindication of the armed forces. Alfonso's popularity continued to fall. In September 1987, the party suffered a crushing defeat in the elections for governors, deputies, mayors, and council members, and Peronism once again seized the reins of the political majority. Peronists returned to the streets to celebrate their victory. It was a vote of no confidence in the president. The uprising continued. Former Lieutenant Colonel Aldo Rico escaped from his place of detention, took refuge in the Monte Castros garrison in Buenos Aires, and prepared another rebellion with the support of 200 soldiers and officers. They swore to fight at any cost to redeem the honor of the Argentine armed forces. Troops surrounded them, and after a short battle in 6 hours, they surrendered. Rico was confined to a military prison. Alfonso once again could boast that democracy had been strengthened and the house was in order. The people applauded the president again. In November, more than 200 Campanata officers, led by Colonel Muhammad Ali Sinaydlin, the Turk, rebelled in the engineering school at the Campo de Mayo. Sinaydlin took up the well-known banner of vindication for the armed forces. He demanded total amnesty for officers convicted or accused of human rights violation and the release of the former commanders who had been members of the junta. He also demanded salary increases, an increase in the defense budget, which Alfonso had cut in half, and the removal of General Dante Caridi, commander-in-chief of the general staff. Again, the people crowded the Campo de Mayo in defense of democracy, and again the police tried to break them up by using tear gas. Alfonso's order to put down the rebellion, he was in Washington on an official visit, was met with an ambiguity equal to the earlier disobedience. Caridi chose an army corps stationed in Cordoba, 435 miles from Buenos Aires, but its commander refused to take part in an operation against Sinaydlin. Troops put down the rebellion on Caridi's orders. 1 person died, 5 were wounded, and more than 100 were arrested. As they began to withdraw, the people shouted, "Cowards, cowards, Caridi's just like Sinaydlin." On December 1st, a squad of 53 officers and sailors of the coastal police deserted their garrison in Buenos Aires in support of Rios, arriving in 3 trucks and armed with more than 200 rifles. They appeared in the Campo de Mayo among the mutineers and led by Sinaydlin. Also in December, 855 soldiers, led by an officer, took over the Villa Martinelli base, making the oft-repeated demand for military amnesty. Other garrisons and regiments attempted to rebel, but were kept under control. Again, democracy emerged strengthened, and again Alfonso came out with flying colors. He noted that there had been no negotiations, nor that he made concessions to the mutineers. But as before, the negotiations were happening under the table. A Buenos Aires newspaper headline read, "There is no pact, but it is being fulfilled." The crisis and the deterioration of the military went very deep. The Minister of Defense, a civilian, assured the country that the military malaise was due to deeper causes, including low salaries, the emotional fallout of the humiliating defeat in the Malvinas, and the national rejection of the repression in the war against subversion. All were chronic ailments. At dawn on January 23rd, 1989, an armed force group of more than 65 men and women attacked the La Tablada regiment in Buenos Aires. Alfonso ordered the armed forces to stifle it. This time his orders were followed with unusual rapidity and violence. Almost immediately, 300 soldiers appeared outside the regimental barracks. The army did not attempt to negotiate, nor did it heed the white flags of the rebels. It leveled everything. The counterattack was massive. It attacked the headquarters with tanks, mortars, long and medium range artillery, and firebombs, prohibited under the Vienna Convention. Units of the elite forces were airlifted to the scene. After 30 hours of fierce combat, the attackers surrendered. 36 people died, among them 8 soldiers and 1 policeman, and 63 were wounded. The building was destroyed and in flames. Inside the headquarters, there were 5 burned corpses. The number of arrested guerrillas dropped as the number of the disappeared grew. Executions and tortures were reported. This was the most violent, bloody, confused, and manipulated event of Alfonso's 5 years in office. The armed forces characterized the La Tablada takeover as a widespread international conspiracy of the left and claimed it signaled the resurgence of the guerrillas. It was clear that the assault had not taken the military by surprise. Soldiers' version of the events, confirmed by the Buenos Aires newspaper La Nación, indicated the military and police units had been put on a state of alert, that defenses had been reinforced, and that training exercises to repel an attack coming from abroad had been carried out. That day, the army arrived at the barracks within minutes of the attack. The claims that the military had set a trap for the Motherland Movement (MTV), which was responsible for the attack, was confirmed by the surviving guerrillas. They testified that they had been infiltrated by military intelligence and that the operation was blown. The armed forces capitalized on the successful capture of La Tablada and the surrender of the subversive group. The president thanked them for defense of the democratic system. The government appeared to accept the military view of guerrilla resurgence and announced the creation of a National Security Council whose function was to deal with situations of public order and subversion. The council was composed of 9 members, among them commanders of the 3 military branches and some ministers, and presided over by the president. The MTP was a leftist group organized 3 years later by Jorge Manuel Barrios, a respected Buenos Aires lawyer and a former director of the Organization in Defense of Human Rights. He died at La Tablada. Enrico Geraldo Jorayan of the ERP became one of its leaders. 6 months after the attack, in a trial plagued by procedural irregularities, all those arrested were found guilty. The chaos. By 1988, the Argentine economy was rapidly deteriorating. Economic and social indices were catastrophic. Inflation, unemployment, and the price of basic necessities were spiraling upward. The drop in real wages for the working class threw many Argentines into absolute poverty. The astronomical foreign debt exceeded $600 billion, the largest on the southern continent, and defaulted interest payments more than $2 billion caused the government to have serious quarrels with the international banking industry. The Austral Plan and the Spring Plan, which decreed drastic currency adjustments with which Alfonso attempted to mitigate the crisis, caused a wave of work stoppages and labor protests. A general strike called by the CGT in September 1988 became a day of violence and looting without precedent. Rumors of a coup persisted in this tense situation, and the president admitted that such a possibility existed. His relations with the military have been as explosive as a minefield. The military command continued the battle of the generals to make government, already exhausted, vindicate them publicly. The protests by human rights organizations and the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo also continued, accusing Alfonso of propitiating impunity with the complicity of the military courts, an impunity which did not allow the trials to proceed, and they protested when they saw as the weakness of the civilian courts. In the 5 years of democracy, after 7 of the genocidal dictatorships, only 10 officers were found guilty, and those responsible for the uprising and mutinies detained in their own institutions had not been brought to trial. The people had not forgotten the complicity of the church with the military dictatorships and with repression. Some priests supported the dictatorships and kept silent on their violence. Others justified their repressive regimes. Some were present and unmoved at the interrogations and assassinations under torture. 11 years after the military dictatorships ended, when the Curia named Father Christian von Wernick, priest of the Bragado parish, 62 miles from Buenos Aires, the town council declared him persona non grata and asked the bishop to remove him. The bishop refused because von Wernick, he pointed out, had not broken ecclesiastical law. But the people remembered his dark past with his chaplain to the Buenos Aires police, 1976 to 77, and did not forget his friendship with the former general Ramon Camps, one-time chief of police of Buenos Aires province. Camps had been sentenced to 25 years in prison for numerous homicide, kidnappings, and tortures. According to the testimony of a former police officer before CONADEP, after watching the torture and murder of 2 men and a woman, von Wernick said, what we have done is necessary. It is a patriotic act. God knows that it is for the sake of the country. Relatives of 8 of the disappeared also remembered that von Wernick visited them and claimed that he had seen their relatives leave for Uruguay and assured them that they were safe. Because of his involvement in the repressive regime, he was subpoenaed to testify to the trials of the military officers. In December 1988 came the news that von Wernick would celebrate a mass with Bishop Gillian at the Church of Santa Rosa Bragado. More than 2,000 people were waiting for him outside the church. When a car carrying a priest pulled up, the crowd pounced on the priest, shouting, "Assassin, torturer, where is Cecilia?" A 25-year-old woman of Bragado who was tortured and disappeared. A woman dealt him 2 blows. As one woman kicked him in the testicles, another shouted, "That's not von Wernick." Bishop Gillian, who was mistaken for von Wernick, entered the church doubled over in pain, according to Uruguayan weekly Breca. In January 1989, during the last year of Alfonso's administration, a serious energy crisis was brought on by a prolonged drought. The country was half paralyzed. The government had to order the closing of its offices, banks, and many business clinics and hospitals had to cut back their services. Food was rotting in the supermarkets, and industry reported daily losses in the millions. The government lost between 15 million and 42 million a day. The country blamed Alfonso for not having foreseen this emergency, which had been predicted months earlier by experts. He said he was not the only one responsible, since the crisis was due to a succession of errors going back decades. The presidential campaign took place in the midst of this crisis. There was profound national unrest because of the lamentable state of the economy. There were protest demonstration marches by housewives, banging pots and pans, supermarket lootings. 4 days before the election, the economy was pegged to the dollar. Faced with the precipitous fall of the new monetary unit that replaced the peso, and the minute-to-minute oscillation in the exchange rate, people did all their business with the green dollar bill. Carlos Saul Menem, the Peronist candidate for president, threatened to bring Alfonso before a political court for his ill-fated political economy. There was a change in the Ministry of Finance, and the indices exploded again without anyone being able to explain why. Antonio Tricali, a former minister of the Interior, suggested that the only recourse left to the Argentines was prayer. The general feeling was one of standing at the edge of an abyss. Alfonso lost control of the economy and the country. The newspapers were more concerned with the price hikes and the ups and downs of the dollar than with the campaign. This disillusionment with Alfonso worked against Eduardo Angolas, the URD candidate. On May 14, people came out in droves to vote. Carlos Saul Menem, Peronist, populist, and demagogue, won 49% of the vote against Angelo's 37%. Parents in several cities celebrated Menem's victory with an outpouring of joy. The following day, the country returned to its harsh reality. The economic situation deteriorated by the hour. Alfonso announced a plan for a war economy with new taxes, sole control of the exchange rate, and reductions in public spending. But he offered increases in retirement benefits and family aid. While he was proposing these measures, the people in the city of Rosario looted supermarkets. The following day, faced with another wave of looting, which was beginning to spread throughout the country, leaving many dead and hundreds wounded, Alfonso decreed a 30-day state of siege. It became clear that Alfonsin's resignation was more than a rumor. He announced that he had reached an agreement with Menem for the good of Argentina, that he would resign before completing his term. To get around the legal question raised by this unusual case, he and Menem agreed that he would renounce the presidency before Congress and that Congress would confirm Menem. And that was how it was done. Menem, a pardon and a forgetting. On July 8, 1989, 5 months before Alfonsin's presidential term was due to end, Menem assumed the presidency of Argentina. He agreed to take the reins of power in a moment of severe crisis because there was no alternative. He took the oath of office before his brother Eduardo, president of the Senate. In his inaugural address, Menem announced that the country would experience a difficult, costly, and harsh adjustment. I can offer the people only sacrifice, work, and hope. We have come to say to Argentina, rise and walk. Argentines, on your feet to bring an end to our crisis. In a clear message to the armed forces, he assured them that among all Argentines, we will find a definitive and lasting solution to the wounds that have not yet healed. We shall not rouse the ghosts of the struggle. We shall serenade the spirit. He received a lengthy ovation. Afterward, in a brief ceremony at the Casa Rosada, he received the baton and the presidential sash from Alfonsin. The people's fury and frustration poured over Alfonsin. They sent him off with insults shouting, "Son of a bitch!" exclamation mark. He left exhausted with dark bags under his eyes. In spite of the catastrophic end to his term, he had ensured the survival of the state of law, representative democratic institutions, and civil rights and liberties to the end of his term, his mandate. Many gave him due credit. In 3 months, Menem pardoned hundreds of officers who had been tried and convicted on charges of human rights violations, along with 435 carapinitores, people responsible for many uprisings during Alfonsin's terms and those guilty of the military defeat in the Malvinas. He also pardoned imprisoned guerrillas. Mario Firmenich, the top Montenegro leader, who was serving a 30-year term, was not included. The officers were freed and exempted from any lawsuits brought against them in the civilian courts. I know there will be discontent, as there is in all things of life, but I am convinced that there are millions of Argentines who applaud these measures. Menem remarked. At the end of December, Menem pardoned Videla, Viola, Macera, Suarez Mason, all former members of the military junta and camps, as well as Firmenich. Opinion polls showed that between 60 and 80% were opposed to pardoning these officers, who were responsible for one of the greatest tragedies in Argentina history. The transfer of the officers to the Campo de Mayo, the place where they were to be notified of their release, was carried out in the greatest secrecy and under heavy security. Menem did not want it to become a media spectacle. Pagina 12, a center-left daily, boasted the headline, "Nothing happened here." Other writers might dwell on Menem's economic success during the early years of his government and what would ensue thereafter, but open wounds remain. In March 1989, the anniversary of Videla's coup, mass demonstrations took place in Buenos Aires, again demanding that the cases of the pardoned officers be reopened and the Chamber of Deputies repeal the full-stop laws by a large majority. Time did nothing to ease the heavy consciences of some of the perpetrators. Former officers and priests gradually disclosed hair-raising aspects of the internal war against subversion in which they had taken place. The people continued to demand justice, and the mothers and grandmothers of the Plaza del Mayo, symbols of the national conscience, continued to march as a demand that their sons, daughters, and grandchildren be returned to them alive. Brazil, under its quote-unquote own doctrine. During the first months of the military governments of the so-called revolution, better known as the National Security Doctrine dictatorships, the Brazilian press kept count of more than 25,000 arrests and published hundreds of witness accounts of torture cases. These data contrasted with official statistics, which claimed only 4,700 arrests for political crimes and no deaths in prison, because there is no torture in Brazil, quotes, during 13 years of dictatorship. Brazil entered the 1970s under the iron hand of General Emilio Garastazzi Medici, 1969 to 1974, the third revolutionary quote-unquote government, with its international image seriously diminished by the brutal repression of these governments. The military muzzled the press with strict official censorship, preventing it from reporting on matters relating to public order. Serious human rights violations by the military regimes were denounced by human rights organizations in the country and abroad, as well as by national and foreign jurists, the international press, from the pulpits and the hierarchy of the Brazilian Catholic Church, in pastoral letters and in public statements. The world was aware of what was happening in Brazil. The country's negative foreign image worried Medici and other generals who recognized that the insurgency and social arrests, which continued despite repressive measures, were due to the profound inequalities and injustices in the country's society, and they believed that a change of policies was necessary. To improve Brazil's image, Medici promised to end torture, decontract the repression, attempt to stop the activities of the, quote, death squad, a clandestine organization responsible for many crimes, and narrow the gap between rich and poor through social integration and mass participation in development programs. To counter the accusations that the military had handed over, quote unquote, Brazil to the United States and the transnational corporations, he quietly adopted a policy of nationalism and greater opening toward Latin America. Promises were one thing, but reality was another. Medici, a firm believer in the national security doctrine, issued executive decrees and introduced constitutional amendments to legitimize the concentration of power in the executive branch and reduce that of the courts and the Congress. He dealt with questions of national security by means of secret and confidential decrees, but the military's lax interpretation of the concepts threat to security covered everything that displeased them at any level. The repression of Medici regime was more brutal than that of his predecessor. Cases of torture in the detention centers rose at alarming rates. He also reinstated the death penalty, suspended since 1822, and established a policy of banishment for those deemed undesirable and harmful, quote unquote, to the national security. In the first 3 months of his government, there were more than 600 cases of torture, among them 52 police and military officers accused of subversion who were tortured by their colleagues. Cardinal Paul Arns, Archbishop of Sao Paulo, asked his priests to pray for them. The church hierarchy was the main voice of denunciation of official repression. Cardinal Arns and Don Helder Camaro, Archbishop of Olinda and Recife, Brazil's impoverished northeast, and other bishops never ceased to condemn the regime's brutality, from which members of the church were not exempt. Some of the priests and laypersons working with the Christian grassroots communities among the poor were arrested and tortured. The Brazilian Bar Association published the results of an investigation into the activities of the death squad, which included among its members active and retired police officers, some of the highest rank, and revealed the names of 60 police and military torturers, the methods they used, and the deaths under torture in the prisons. The information was obtained from a document signed by 35 political prisoners in which they recounted the tortures they suffered in the detention centers. Although the Brazilian guerrilla groups had neither the size nor the impact of the Tupamaros in Uruguay or the Montoneros in the ERP in Argentina, they became a huge problem for the military, and at times they shook the regime with the international repercussions their attacks caused. Medici had to deal with the abduction in 1969 of United States Ambassador Charles Elbrick by a commando from two guerrilla groups. A woman guerrilla had seduced his guards in order to procure information on his comings and going. This event caught Medici off guard. He had assumed the presidency because the former president, Arturo da Costa y Silva, was forced to resign after suffering a cerebral hemorrhage. To prevent armed coming to the ambassador, the military bowed to the guerrillas' demands. In March 1970, guerrillas kidnapped the Japanese consul in Sao Paulo and the West German ambassador. They were outraged by his arrogance, and later the Swiss ambassador. The diplomats were freed a few days after, since the government kept its promise to free the imprisoned guerrillas, transfer them to other countries, Mexico, Algeria, and Chile, and publish their communiques. The Swiss ambassador was held for 40 days because the negotiations with the government on the list of prisoners, there were 70, took longer. Such blows humiliated the regime and called international attention to the brutal repression used by the Brazilian military dictatorships. Medici aspired to turn Brazil into a world power and a leader in Latin America. Washington had the same desires. As Brazil goes, quote unquote, so goes South America, said President Nixon, encouraging Medici on his official visit to Washington in 1971. Brazil was a paradise to its investors and the multinationals, and was the United States' principal ally in Latin America. With these dreams of grandeur and in connection with the triumphant extravagance of his government, Medici undertook the construction of a gigantic bridge between Rio de Janeiro and Niterói, of the Trans-Amazon Superhighway, and of the soccer stadiums of several cities, since soccer was the favorite sport of the Brazilian people. The construction of the superhighway through the jungle, important as it was, resulted in enormous tragedies. It meant the violent confiscation of the lands of the indigenous people and the settlers, and massacres when they tried to resist, and the cutting down of the rainforest caused irreparable ecological damage. In April 1972, when the construction began, a new armed group, the Fueras Guerrillas de Araguala, the guerrilla forces of Araguala, took up the defense of indigenous people and campesinos to prevent them from losing their lands. Medici also appeared to turn Brazil into a nuclear power. He refused to sign the Tlatelolco Treaty banning nuclear proliferation in Latin America. In 1975, he signed an agreement on nuclear cooperation and technical assistance with West Germany, and another with Israel for the exploitation of Brazil's uranium reserves. Brazil developed its military industries and became an arms exporter. The so-called Brazilian miracle aroused international admiration. It fostered growth that put the country in eighth place in world industrial development by means of a high foreign debt and the opening of the country to foreign investors. It attracted such investment with broad fiscal incentives, 10-year tax exemptions, free exportation of profits, and the climate of political tranquility it offered. Much of the multi-million-dollar foreign investment came from the United States. There was an influx of multinationals which made inroads into key sectors of Brazil's economy. In 5 years, economic growth reached the annual figure of 11.4%. The quote-unquote miracles caused was the dependency that the multi-million-dollar investments imposed on the government, since it was obliged to consult with the multinational corporations and their governments about its own economic policies. Such policies led to an excessive concentration of wealth, the greatest in Brazil's history, that benefited powerful, wealthy minorities, such as bankers, landholders, and national and foreign businessmen, and widened the gap between the rich and poor. In 1974, Medici's last year in office, the quote-unquote miracle stopped being miraculous. The growth index fell to 4%, and the following year to 3%. The economic recession began. Inflation reached 100%, and the foreign debt came in at $21 billion, an unpayable sum. Impoverishment hit not only the lower classes, but also the middle classes and business sectors. A growing mass movement protested the critical economic situation and the brutal repression. Continuous strikes, work stoppages, land takeovers, and student and popular demonstrations demanded justice, the restoration of democracy, and an end to repressive measures and the suppression of the institutional acts. The violent opposition was not against Medici alone, but it was against the military dictatorship, the birth of democratization. When General Ernesto Geisel, 1974 to 1979, the fourth National Security Doctrine president, assumed powers, all that had remained of the insurgent groups were the Fuerzas Guerrillas de Araguaia. They were in the forest defending indigenous people and campesinos against the despoiling of their lands and the army's brutal repression. The military government sustained themselves by terror. As social tensions grew and deepened, they passed laws and issued decrees and institutional acts to solidify their power and legalize the repression. But this thicket of new laws, adopted in the heat of action, led to contradiction within the military establishment. Not all officers were in agreement with these policies. One of the detractors was Geisel. Giesel knew that the world was aware that the price of internal order had been paid with brutal repression. He could no longer speak of the economic miracle which had ceased to exist, having been artificially sustained by an astronomical foreign debt. In his inaugural address, he spoke of the gradual redemocratization of the country, of a more open and secure society letting up on press censorship and involving civilian society in plans for development. The foreign press reported his speech in the optimistic opinion that it signaled a promise of change. Giesel understood that retreat was necessary, but that he must do so without creating conflict in the armed forces. He opted for the policy of decompression. He learned press censorship and police repression and opened the political arena to the Partido Movimento Democrático Brasileiro, Brazilian Democratic Movement Party, MDB, the only legal opposition party. The MDB was not a threat to the military, since the government controlled the majority in Congress, although the Alianza Nacional Renovada Party, ARENA, National Alliance for Renewal, which it created. But in November 1974, the elections to the parliament and provincial assemblies, the first direct legislative elections under the military regimes, the MDB almost doubled its representation in the Senate and the Chamber of the Deputies and defeated ARENA in the provincial assemblies of Sao Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, and Rio Grande do Sul, which were the most important ones. The government was alarmed by these results, since the MDB could win the election of governors, which was scheduled for the following year. Giesel found that sectors of the military opposed his open policies and boycotted his plans to lessen the repression. His main objective was to improve Brazil's international image. The army command did not allow him to control the security apparatus, which continued acting on its own, and its actions continued to be denounced by the foreign press. The arrest and torture of a former United States Methodist missionary and occasional correspondent for the Time and the Associated Press were a great scandal because of Washington's vigorous protests. Such acts worried Giesel because they damaged his government's image. Cardinal Arms, Archbishop of Sao Paulo, a harsh critic the military, gave Giesel a list of 22 disappeared persons, 21 of whom had been taken under his government, and asked that he investigate them. Giesel promised to do so, but he could not fulfill his promise since he could not control the security services. The murder of the journalist Vladimir Herzog in the Sao Paulo ministry prison in October 1975 caused a great national and international scandal. The official version was that Herzog had committed suicide. No one believed that story. Cardinal Arms rejected the idea that from the pulpit of the cathedral, and later officiated at a dramatic ecumenical funeral. Herzog was Jewish in the cathedral. The military commission named by the government to investigate Herzog's death confirmed the suicide version, quote unquote, and the investigation was suspended. The quote suicides in the detention centers usually happened in the Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro barracks. Whenever an officer was found responsible for such a death, he was relieved of his duties at worst. In 1976, a wave of repressive measures was unleashed against servants of the church. In July, Father Rodolfo Lukenbein, a German missionary working with indigenous people in the Amazon, was murdered. In October, the police killed Father João Bosco Pinedo Brunier for having protested the torture of a woman. In September, Dom Adriano Hipólito, Bishop of Louva Iguazu, was kidnapped, beaten, and left naked on a highway. In spite of his declared intentions to abolish the repression, Giesel made use of the Institutional Act No. 5, AI 5, a monument to military arbitrariness, when it suited him. In 1977, empowered by this act, he closed the Congress when the MDP refused to approve a judicial reform proposed by the government. The MDP held that it had made no sense to approve the measure until the government abolished AI 5 and the national security law. Still, Giesel's decompression policies opened the door to popular and student demonstrations, supported by vast sectors of the people in the Catholic Church hierarchy, protesting the repressive measures and demanding the restoration of democracy. For the first time under the military regime, the media also denounced official violence and pointed to the army's repressive apparatus as responsible for this violence. In May 1978, in a public declaration, the National Law School asked for a return to the state of law, a new constitution, amnesty, and the complete revision of labor legislation. Day by day, the government felt stronger pressure from the people and the growing demand that it permit a return to democracy and suppress the repressive laws, especially AI5, since they impeded the democratization of the country. The weight of the opposition MDP party was strong enough for the Congress to approve a constitutional amendment to abolish AI5, reestablish habeas corpus for political detainees, cease media censorship, do away with the death penalty and life sentences, and restore the powers of the judiciary. The president could no longer order Congress, closed as before, to deprive members of Congress of their mandate or the citizens their political rights. Certain articles of this amendment, however, gave new extensive powers to the executive branch. The Lawyers College and the opposition said that they were, quote, the resurrection of AI5. Giesel reestablished political rights for 120 persons, most of them in exile, but he excluded 8 prominent political figures, among them Leonel Brizola, governor of Rio Grande del Sul, and Luis Carlos Prestes, the former Secretary General of the Communist Party, both in exile. Giesel chose General João Baptista Figueiredo, the Arena official party candidate, to succeed him in the presidency. It was not a direct election. Figueiredo was elected in the Electoral College 352 to 266. It continued to be the job of the Electoral College, imposed by the military after the coup against Goulart in 1964, to control the election of the presidents. Figueiredo was the 5th and last president, 1971 to 1985, of the so-called revolution. He promised to continue Giesel's policy of political opening and gradual democratization. He granted amnesty for political crimes, approved by Congress in August 1979. It did not include terrorist acts or armed resistance against the government, and restored the political rights suppressed by institutional acts. Many exiles returned to the country, among them Leonel Brizola, Luis Carlos Prestes, and Maria Moreira Alves, a journalist and member of Congress. Communists and Trotskyists also returned. Brazil showed a democratic face for the first time in many years. Figueiredo's popularity was enormous, both at home and abroad. Figueiredo assumed office in the midst of a massive strike by 160,000 workers in the metallurgical industry in Sao Paulo, supported by workers from other industries and vast numbers of the population. Social unrest, which increased under Giesel's government, gained strength with the support of the church, led by Cardinal Arns. Between January and October in 1979, where there were 400 work stoppages in Rio de Janeiro, Sao Paulo, Belo Horizonte, and Rio del Sul by workers in the transportation, steel, education, sanitation, construction, stevedore, trucking, banking, and telecommunications industry, and by public officials. Business leaders opted to solve the labor conflicts in direct negotiation with the workers, since they understood that repression, which had been used, was not adequate. Such a policy favored the workers. The economy was in a spiral of deterioration because of the oil crisis, the effects of a worldwide recession, and the cost of the quote-unquote boom connected with the miracle based on the crushing foreign debt. The economic industries were catastrophic. The fiscal deficit, inflation, unemployment, and the cost of living were at their worst in many years. There was the flight of capital. The country reserves dwindled to 2.9 billion, and foreign investment fell from 10.1 billion in 1978 to 6.5 billion in 1979. The greatest cost of the miracle was the miserable poverty of the lowest classes. The Minister of Planning announced the miracle was dead, but the economic elite, who had lived through 11 years when industry and business flourished and the powerful classes pulled down large profits, did not want to hear bad news. The minister was made to resign. Figueiredo named Delfim Neto, the architect of the miracle, in his place. He was welcomed with unbridled enthusiasm by this elite. Figueiredo enjoyed a degree of popularity not given to his predecessors. Civil advances continued under Figueiredo. In 1982, the first direct gubernatorial elections under the military regime, the opposition candidates won once again with 59% of the vote. They won 9 states, including Sao Paulo, Rio, Minas Gerais, and Paraná. Leonel Brizola was elected governor of Rio. Nevertheless, the MDP remained the minority party in Congress and in Electoral College and was responsible for electing the president. A presidential election was slated for 1984. The economic situation continued to be difficult in the extreme. In January 1983, Figueiredo signed an agreement with the IMF and obtained an enormous loan. Reputable economists were alarmed and questioned the deal. The conditions the IMF imposed on Brazil, austerity and a drastic reduction in the swollen inflation rate and public deficit, were not realistic. The economists insisted Figueiredo had committed the country to the impossible. In September, Figueiredo signed another, less stringent agreement. An official of the IMF declared that the fund had adjusted to the country's reality. In 1984, Brazil registered the fourth year of reductions in per capita income, when corruption scandals and embezzlement of huge sums involving people in the upper levels of government made the front pages of the newspapers. The government was struck a severe blow. The accusations leveled not only at Figueiredo, but all at the armed forces and the military dictatorship as well. Figueiredo called for presidential elections. On January 15, 1985, the Electoral College chose the opposition candidate Tancredo Neves and Jose Sarney by 400 out of 606 votes. The official candidate, Paulo Maluf, received 100 votes. Neves promised to re-democratize the country. Neves promised to democratize the country, achieve economic growth by controlling inflation, and stop the bleeding of foreign debt interest payments with the, quote, philosophy of negotiation. He offered to convene a constitutional convention in 1987 to set the rules of the game for the new republic and remove the, quote, authoritarian rubble without revenge. He promised to promote social justice. He declared that the social debt was at least as explosive as the foreign debt, the world's largest, and needed to be dealt with immediately. Neves died before his inauguration, and the people wept as if they had lost a savior. Jose Sarney, his running mate, stepped into his presidency by constitutional mandate. The people did not believe him, since he was one of the most conspicuous civilian servants. He directed the parliamentary battle that defeated the constitutional amendment, reestablishing direct elections, an action responsible for the people's bitterness. They accepted him because it was the law. Brazilian sub-imperialism. Brazil was Latin America's greatest power. It was the largest and richest country, and it exercised undeniable leadership. Its foreign policy had been an example of balance, independence, and pragmatism, directed toward the economic and commercial good of the country. The same policy was followed by the military. Though Medici, without taking positions on principle, supported Portugal's policy against liberation movements in its overseas provinces, Brazil was the first to recognize the MPLA's victory in Angola. It maintained a strong and fruitful commercial exchange with South Africa. A quarter of its trade was with Africa, but condemned apartheid. With its neighbor, it maintained a policy of imperialism, intervention through investments by the private sector, especially in the banking industry, plans for the exploitation of their riches, and the construction of large-scale engineering projects, and it pushed campesinos' emigration toward the frontier districts, employing a theory of living borders as a means of transgressing geopolitical boundaries. But covertly, the ploy also affected the country's internal affairs. In 1971, Brazil collaborated in the preparation of General Hugo Banzer's coup in Bolivia against General Juan José Torres, who was considered a leftist. The coup was a military conspiracy by Brazil, Argentina, Bolivia, and the United States. Brazil's intervention was so open that it moved President Allende to exclaim, "Chile now has a border with Brazil." Relations with the United States fluctuated. In 1964, the United States Embassy conspired with the coup leaders to overthrow João Goulart. Later, under military dictatorship, there was an invasion of American advisors in Brazil, part of United States aid, who were placed in key positions in the administration, the armed forces, the police, and the security forces. American counterinsurgency policy and the national security doctrine were identical, including the torture centers. To the United States, Brazil was the Latin American superpower and its most important ally in the continent. Nixon's Secretary of State Henry Kissinger went on a lightning tour through several countries in Latin America in February 1976, and he told Geisel that Brazil was the great power called to join the club of rich nations. He signed an agreement with Geisel that covered questions of economics, politics, security, education, law, culture, and technology. They also spoke about a South Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was opposed by some segments of the Brazilian military. In spite of all these maneuvers, Nixon froze aid to Brazil when the military passed the Institutional Act Number 5, which granted it absolute power to the military regime, AI-5. With the arrival of Jimmy Carter in the White House in 1977, relations worsened because of his defense of human rights, which these regimes seriously violated. He talked about cutting aid to Brazil. Geisel considered this a threat and interference in Brazil's internal affairs and broke up bilateral military accord MAP. United States military and economic aid was suspended. To the opposition, on the other hand, Carter was a beacon of hope. Brazil sought closer cooperation with Europe and Japan, developed its own military industry. It became an arms exporter and undertook nuclear programs in partnership with West Germany. Washington tried to hamper them, and Israel to exploit its uranium reserves. With the arrival of Ronald Reagan, relations once again turned excellent. Both spiritedly waved their anti-communist and counterinsurgent banners. They were birds of a feather. Uruguay and its internal war. In the 1970s, the last year of Jorge Pacheco Areco's administration, Uruguay was afflicted with a severe crisis, economic disintegration, social agitation, union struggles, and growing guerrilla activity. The Tupamaros held the government in check. The country was suffering the effects of 10 years of economic recession. Inflation, the fiscal deficit, and foreign debt were on the rise. Currency was losing value at an accelerating rate. From 6 pesos to the dollar in 1959, it dropped to 400 in 1970. There was flight of capital and a high unemployment rate. The salaried, lower, and middle classes, the most strongly affected, protested with strikes, work stoppages, and large demonstrations. Pacheco ruled with a heavy hand. The country continued under the security measures he had imposed in 1968 to meet the challenges of guerrilla activity and the social and student unrest. The majority of the national white and Colorado red parties approved the repressive measures the government asked for, even though they curtailed civil liberties. They limited freedom of the press and of association, barred the holding of meetings, and prohibited union activities. The exemplary Uruguayan democratic tradition disappeared without direct opposition, since the parties were in shambles and leaderless, and with the support of powerful political and economic sectors. Pacheco slowly strengthened a de facto dictatorship. The common terms were that he was imposing a constitutional dictatorship or quote-unquote fake democracy. In Montevideo, the same main scene of violence, there was an atmosphere of anxiety and insecurity, since the repressive measures were not against subversion alone, but also against popular union and leftist movements and organizations. The union movement, the National Workers' Federation, CNT, made up most of the country's unions, and the Tupamaros, who enjoyed enormous sympathy among students and in segments of the political, professional, intellectual, and leftist movement sectors, opposed the repression. They were the stream where the guerrilla fish swam. The Tupamaros' daring blows against the financial, industrial, and banking industries elicited tremendous enthusiasm among the popular majorities, since they exposed the corruption of the government and of powerful economic sectors. In their assaults on these institutions, the Tupamaros appropriated millions in money as well as documents which they related to the press. Fraud and the names of persons involved in those crimes came to light. Such scandals shook the banking system. The Tupamaros became one of the central vectors of the political landscape in Uruguay. The government did not succeed in putting an end to labor agitation or in putting down the growing guerrilla activities. In April 1970, the Tupamaros executed police inspector Hector Moran Cherquero, whom they accused of instituting torture. In July, they kidnapped the British ambassador and 3 diplomats, and in August, the Tupamaros abducted and executed Dan Mitrone, an American security agent who was advancing the Uruguayan police. This last action was traumatic for Pacheco since the United States did not want him to negotiate with the guerrillas. When Mitrone's corpse appeared with bullet wounds of various calibers, Pacheco declared a state of exceptions. In daring operations in September 1971, the guerrillas freed their companion from 3 prisons, and in another action, they fired 100 guerrillas from the Punta Carreras prison without firing they freed 100 guerrillas from the Punta Carreras prison without firing a single shot. In April 1972, their D-Day, they executed 4 people they accused of being members of the Death Squad. This was their response to the assassination of 3 guerrillas by paramilitary groups. The appearance of these ultra-right groups, a new phenomenon in Uruguay, marked the beginning of the dirty war against the left. Uruguayan society was alarmed by this violence, and the majority in the Congress approved the government's repressive measures. Between September 1972 and March 1973, it agreed on 3 occasions to retain the MPS security measures to fight subversion. In order to participate in the impending presidential elections, political segments created the Frente Amplio Broad Front. It included the Communist Party, illegal but tolerated, movements and parties of the left, the Christian Democrats, factions of the Colorado and Blanco national parties, independent sectors, and retired military officers. The front was supported by powerful CNT and the Tupamaros. Its candidates were Liber Serragni, a prestigious retired general. The Blancos party candidate was Wilson Ferreira Aldune. The official candidate, supported by Pacheco, was Juan Maria Bordaberry. 2 months before the elections, Pacheco gave carte blanche to the armed forces to fight the guerrillas. The MPS and the state of exception gave legal sanctions to unleash brutal repression against subversive activities, popular and union organizations and their leaders, politicians of the left and the front. More than 300 attempts were made on its members' lives, among them Serragni. Clandestine paramilitary groups of the ultra-right took part in this violence. As in the rest of Latin America, the Uruguayan military and security forces received training and were aided by advisors from the United States. This had been Mitrone's mission. Where the general rules, Bordaberry does not. In October 1971, amid a climate of violence, the presidential elections were held, the most turbulent in Uruguayan history. According to many observers, Jose Maria Bordaberry, the official candidate, was elected by a margin of 100,000 votes over Ferreira Aldunate, the Blanco National Party candidate, who claimed that Bordaberry had won a Pyrrhic, dirty, and fraudulent victory. Though McCarthyite attacks, another new phenomenon to Uruguay, were in abundance during the campaign against Serragni, the candidate of the Broad Front. He registered 20% of the vote nationally and 30% in Montevideo, which had the highest turnout. In spite of this advance for the opposition, official power was not weakened. Bordaberry's victory strengthened the ultra-right, a member of the landholding oligarchy, a pre-Vatican Council Catholic, and a man with fascist tendencies. He professed to admire the Brazilian dictatorship as a political model. He began his presidential term of 6 years, 1971 to 1977, as a continuation of Pacheco's regime. Extreme guerrilla activity, the popular mobilization promoted by the Broad Front, and the campaign of union agitation launched by the CNT, work stoppages, protests, and strikes to demand agrarian reform, and increase in salaries, and price controls all gave the military and Bordaberry reason to increase the repression. Within a week of taking office, Bordaberry sent to the Senate a proposal for a law on security, state security and public order, more severe than the MPS, and with greater resources for the military, which was immediately passed. This law paved the way for the military to move into power. After a national work stoppage to heretofore unseen proportions, the four guerrilla operations in April 1972, in which the Tupamaros executed members of the regime they accused of belonging to the death squad, the army initiated a wave of raids and arrests. It persuaded Congress to enact immediately a law declaring the country to be in a state of internal welfare, though such a concept did not exist in the Uruguayan constitution. The deputies from the Broad Front were the only ones to vote against it. The government suspended guarantees of individual freedoms and expedited a decree making political crimes and subversive actions acts of war, which would be tried in military courts. Under the state of internal warfare, quote unquote, the armed forces drowned the country in blood. The war was carried out indiscriminately against the left. The army leveled its party and union headquarters, systematically arrested hundreds of people, used torture during interrogations, and killed or disappeared activists and supported guerrillas. 9 members of the Communist Party were killed in their offices, and Tupamaros were massacred when they were found. In November, according to military sources, 62 guerrillas were killed and 2,873 were captured. 18 soldiers also died in these confrontations. The government was in the hands of the military, and Bordaberry became increasingly unpopular and isolated. Many called for his resignation. The traditional parties who approved Pacheco and Bordaberry's anti-democratic and fascistic measures were now alarmed by the limitless repression exercised by the military. Bordaberry gave them a free hand to control public order, a function not contemplated in the Constitution. The traditional parties were alarmed by this increase in militarism, but they lacked the power to stop it. The political class, increasingly marginalized, saw that the military were invading its territory. The threat was real. Some attempted to retake power with a timid anti-militarist campaign. Still, when Bordaberry needed the politicians' backing to party the public show of contempt by the army and the air force, they would not give it. After the military refused to follow Bordaberry's account to oust the recently named Minister of Defense, they called for the president's resignation and a national inquiry. Without an opposition, the way was open for the military to intervene in the management of the state. They dealt the first blow. In February 1973, they signed the Boiso Lanza Pact with Bordaberry, named after the military base where they met, which allowed them to take control of the parts of the administration. They created the Consejo de Seguridad Nacional, COSINO, National Security Council, composed of the president, the ministers of defense, foreign relations, economy, and planning, and the commanders of 3 branches of the military. The pact reduced the president's formal powers. Very little real power remained to him, but Bordaberry did not protest. The parliament and the political parties remained silent, and the left showed a relative passivity and neutrality. With extra constitutional powers and a free reign, the military dealt a second blow. At dawn on June 27, 1973, they placed Montevideo under military rule, and a 7 a.m. broadcast announced that an executive order closing the Congress. The announcement declared that it would be replaced by a Council of State and that the Constitution would be reformed and approved by a national plebiscite. The same night, Bordaberry took responsibility in a broadcast on the communications media for this unique coup, which established an equally unique civilian military dictatorship. Bordaberry would continue as the constitutional president, but the armed forces held the power. He had become a puppet. The people said, when the general rules, Bordaberry does not. Where the general rules, Bordaberry does not. The second blow caused protests from the parties and the Broad Front. The CNT called a strike, which was joined by segments of the people and of the left. It lasted 15 days and paralyzed the country. Serigny called on Bordaberry to resign. The opposition had no success, and the country returned to routine under the consolidated civilian military dictatorship. The political class and the opportunistic and pragmatic middle class began to empower themselves through compliance with the regime. In July, Serigny was arrested. He remained in prison for more than 10 years. The military began to destroy democratic institutions. They closed the Congress for refusing to expel Enrico Arro, the senator from the Broad Front, whom they called a traitor. They outlawed the CNT, prohibited political activity by the parties, shut down independent newspapers, imposed censorship on the rest, intervened in the university, and declared the opposition a danger to state security. The prisons proved to be too small. They set up concentration camps and detention centers, including railway cars and abandoned boats. A new prison opens every month. This is what the economists call a development plan, quote unquote, wrote historian and writer Eduardo Galeano. In Uruguay, as in Argentina and Brazil, quote unquote, suicides and quote, death while attempting to escape became routine in prisons. And the disappearances, arbitrary arrests, and denunciations of torture in the detention centers mounted. As in Argentina, raids were carried out with beatings, lootings, and property destruction, and the perpetrators did not bother to erase the traces they left. There was no danger to them, for no one investigated these crimes. Bordaberry, still occupying the seat of the presidency, sought closer friendships with the neighboring military dictatorships. In April 1976, he presented the Great Cross of Protectors of Free Peoples, the medals he created, to the Chilean dictator Augusto Pinochet, on whose shoulders rested the assassination and disappearance of thousands of Chileans, and Alfredo Stroessner, who suffocated Paraguay with his dictatorship for 20 years. He visited the Bolivian dictator Hugo Banzer, who came to power in one of the most bloodiest coups of his country's rocky history, and invited Ernesto Geisel, the Brazilian thug, to Montevideo. The high-level social life was all he had left. More than 100 Uruguayans living in exile in Argentina, Chile, and Brazil were assassinated, abducted, or disappeared in operations coordinated among their security forces. Also in 1976, Hector Gutierrez Ruiz, president of the Uruguayan Chamber of Deputies, and Zelmar Michelini, a longtime senator, were assassinated in Buenos Aires within 2 hours of each other. The same day in the same city, the Uruguayan doctor Manuel Liberov disappeared. The Argentine Minister of Defense claimed that these assassinations were an Uruguayan operation, but he was still not certain whether they were official or not. The upheavals in Uruguay went beyond mere bloodshed. The civilian military government became deeply immersed in a sort of cultural revolution. They burned thousands of books, prohibited certain songs, including 3 of Gardel's tangos, closed plays, decreed prison terms of 1 to 6 years for those who sang the national anthem in public ceremonies with a blatant emphasis on the phrase, "Tremble, tyrants," and for anyone who disparaged the armed forces. The university was under military control, and it remained closed for several months. The military imprisoned professors and deans and closed the faculties of the social sciences and economics for being subversive, as well as the institutes for scientific and economic research. No meeting could be held, not even a birthday party, without a permit from the police. By 1976, the country was bankrupt. The foreign debt stood at $1 billion. The deficit, inflation, and unemployment were growing at an accelerated rate. The economy became denationalized since important sectors passed into the hands of foreign capital and multinational corporations. Beef, the main export, was controlled by United States and British capital, wool by the Dutch, leather and oils by Belgium. Uruguay became one huge prison. There were not more than 8,000 political prisoners, and about 800,000 Uruguayans chose exile. With a population of 2.8 million, Uruguay set the record in Latin America for the per capita repression and exodus of its citizens. The country was emptying. The graffiti on a wall at the Carrasco International Airport in Montevideo read, "The last one to leave, turn off the light." Someone else who believed in the struggle had written, "Comrade, don't go." By 1976, the Tupamaros had been virtually disbanded by the brutal repression. Many died, others were rotting in prison, and still others were in exile. But sabotage against the government and the army and citizen resistance continued. There were more than 50 strikes in spite of the prohibition. The civilian military dictatorship began to hit bottom. Its only support came from the far right and from members of the oligarchy connected to foreign and agro-export capital. No one could tolerate Bordaberry any longer, much less than the military. In 1976, Bordaberry was constrained by a constitutional mandate to call elections, but they could not be held because the military would not allow them. Before they could prohibit them, Bordaberry prescribed them absolutely. In June, the military took control of the government, but kept Bordaberry in the presidency, weighed down by the military misdeeds, which he endured in silence, and after being the butt of the people's jokes because of his ludicrous but harmful role, he finally resigned. The Council of State named Dr. Alberto Demicelli president by decree. On the day of his inauguration, he signed Institutional Acts 1 and 2, suspending the elections that were to be held in November and creating the Council of the Nation as the highest government service. In September, when he refused to sign Institutional Act 4, which prohibited all political activity, the military ousted him and named Dr. Aparicio Mendez in his place. The military kept changing presidents in what seemed to be a political version of musical chairs. Nothing remained of the state law. The military assured its complete autonomy with an intricate tangle of laws and institutional acts. It had already removed the disaffected and the skeptics from its ranks. The international community, alarmed by what was happening in Uruguay, denounced the regime's brutality and demanded a return to democracy. International pressures and accusations of human rights violations forced the military to take steps to improve its image. It decreed Institutional Act 5, which recognized human and individual rights. This inadequate gesture fooled no one. In May 1980, Mendez sent the proposal for the new constitution written by the military to the Council of the State. It was to be ratified by a national plebiscite. One article designated the National Security Council, controlled by the military, as part of the executive branch. Thus, the participation of the armed forces in the government was assured. The presidential election was scheduled for November 1981, with only one candidate and no participation by the left. In the 1986 elections, two candidates would be allowed to run. The military mounted a great campaign seeking popular support for the new constitution, and only the last few weeks did it allow limited propaganda from those who opposed it. The plebiscite, limited to a yes or no vote, was held in November, resulting in 58% against and 42% in favor. The defeat of the voting booth weakened the military and stimulated popular protest against the dictatorship. The people and civilian government demanded a return to democracy, but the military was not inclined to negotiate. Instead, it imposed conditions and maintained its autonomy for the new government. The Blanco National and Colorado parties did not accept the military's ultimatums or the changes the military wanted to impose on the Constitution. Dialogue was suspended. Repression and press censorship continued. In May 1984, a coalition of parties, Colorado, Blanco, Broad Front, and Civic Union, published a statement demanding elections without restrictions or exclusions of the parties of the left. The coalition further asked that any constitutional reform be submitted to a plebiscite. Federico Aldanet returned from exile and the military imprisoned him. The Blanco Party announced that it would not continue negotiating until he was freed. In August, they arrived at an agreement known as the Naval Club Pact. The details were kept secret by both parties to the negotiations. It was supposed that the parties guaranteed that they would not put military officers on trial and that they could leave their posts with clean hands. Presidential elections were held in November. The candidates of Ferreira Aldanate, still in prison, and Sergini had been proscribed, as had participation by the communist and leftist parties. 5,000 people were refused the vote because of so-called political unfitness as determined by the military. Giulio Mario Sanguinetti, the Colorado Party candidate, was elected president. Although he was in the military's good graces and the election had been far from democratic, he was a civil victory, a protected democracy, quote unquote. Julio Maria Sanguinetti, 1985 to 1990, was the first civilian president after 12 years of military dictatorship. He took office in March. He wanted national peace and a policy of reparations for damages. He immediately restored their positions thousands of civil servants who had been dismissed by the military for political reasons, approved the law to release all political prisoners who had been in prison for at least 11 years, and offered to revise the sentences of those who were convicted of blood crimes and to count the years they served in prison as double. Raul Sendic, a top Tupamaro leader who had spent 13 years in prison, was released. Sanguinetti faced an inevitable and dangerous situation with the military establishment. The mass of people demanded that he try those responsible for the dirty war. On this view, military officers who had committed serious violations against human rights ought to pay for their crimes. For an entire year, this was the gist of public debate. Because Sanguinetti knew the opposition was weak and that the parties were splintered, he dropped the bomb. He proposed an amnesty conducive to national coexistence. Broad popular forces, human rights movements, relatives of the victims, the Broad Front, and the Tupamaros, legalized as a political party, protested. The atmosphere heated up when the military warned that it would not appear in court. The Blanco and Colorado parties and the Broad Front suggested other forms of amnesty, but Sanguinetti presented Congress with a proposal for a law titled Expiration of State Punishment, which was a renunciation by the state of the right to convict and penalize members of the armed forces, the security services, and the police indicted for political crimes. Astutely, he called it the National Conciliation Law, that people spoke of it, and the law of impunity, or full stop. It was passed on December 22nd, 1986, by two-thirds of the parliament. The Broad Front and one part of the Blanco Party voted against it. A national movement led by Matilda Rodriguez Larreta, the widow of Hector Gutierrez Ruiz, the former president of the Chamber of Deputies, kidnapped and assassinated in Buenos Aires in 1978, and supported by the Broad Front, parts of the Blanco Party, and the Tupamaros, undertook a campaign to annul the full stop law in plebiscite. Its slogans were equality for all before the law and search for truth. Some parts of the military supported it because they wanted to cleanse their ranks and improve the bad image of the military institution. The debate and propaganda for and against the amnesty lasted 3 years. On April 16, 1989, people voted yes or no in a referendum. The results were 52.6% in favor of keeping the amnesty and 41.1% against. The rest of the ballots were left blank or voided. In Montevideo, home to the most of the population, the no vote won with 54%. There were no celebrations for the victory. A Montevideo newspaper headline read, "They won, but they did not persuade. Those responsible for the dirty war could rest easy, as could the government." On November 26, 1989, the Uruguayan people, who were paralyzed by apathy, went to the polls to elect a new president. The opposition candidate, Luis de Lacalle of the Blanco Party of the center-right, won with 39% of the vote. The Colorado Party candidate, Jorge Battle, received 28%, and Liber Seragni of the Broad Front had 13%. DeKalb was inaugurated in 1990, and Uruguay continued its journey along familiar democratic roads. So I'm going to take a short break, just about a minute, and then I'll make some comments. I'm glad you could join us today. Okay, so I'm going to make a few comments here. We did, three chapters. We did Argentina, Brazil, and Chile. So, in relevance to this presentation, which is Masters of War, and all of our podcasts, we must understand that who was responsible for the national security doctrines was the United States government. The racist, murderous butchers of the United States were responsible for the national security doctrine in Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay. Those were the three countries we reviewed: Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay. Again, we talked of the Falkland conflicts, which, the British and the American government did a murderous thuggery against Argentina that we reviewed already. We talked about Raul Alfonsin, who brought democracy to Argentina. He started democracy, and unfortunately what happened was he had a lot of military subversion. We know that this is U.S. government subversion. The U.S. secretly was, funneling the right-wing dictatorships in the military in Latin America and in Argentina, and they were subverting Alfonso. This is all obvious, just obvious, documented information, documented facts in multiple sources. The U.S. was subverting the democratic push and the leftist push in Argentina. And so they overtook the democratically elected government of Alfonso, who then was overthrown. And overthrown by a coup. And, eventually what happened was, Carlos Saul Menem was a Peronist president, Peronist person. Let me just, I'm just going to make, sure who we're talking. So Alfonso was there. Alfonso's reign was from 1960. Alfonso was the leader, for many years. The victory for Argentina, 1982. He was there starting 1982 after the Falklands defeat and, the huge problem. He took power. He went through Alfonso, the winner. Front page news was Alfonso was the winner. He continued to follow the law and democracy. There were some issues with insurgents and all that. But eventually, he stayed in power for many years. The economy, was, going down, and the democracy, basically after 5 years of democracy and the murderous dictatorships of the United States prior to that, basically, caused the mutinies that were responsible for the downfall. The complicity of the church, we remember the church was responsible. The Roman Catholic Church of the West, the European fascist church, was responsible for, condoning the violence against the peasant Hispanics in Latin America. This is the racist, murderous white butchers of the United States government and their European fascist allies. So continuing on, Menem took power on July 8th, 1989, 5 months before Alfonso's term was to end, assumed the presidency in Argentina. Mr. Alfonso resigned and Menem took over. Alfonso was a democratic person, but Menem was a military person. Menem was, again, a right-wing military person. He was a military dictator. He pardoned hundreds of human rights violators, all of the different, people, the racist torture centers that the United States placed in Argentina were, condoned. They let the generals go free. Racist torture, racist murder, and racist imprisonment by the white, racist, murderous butchers of the United States government. They're, racist butchers of the U.S. government. Continuing on, so Videla, Viola, Massera, Suarez, Mason, all were pardoned. That was pretty much it. Menem was unfortunately the last president, which was, still a military flavor, and it was a military dictatorship. That's where we ended, and that was in, around the 1990s time. Brazil. We know about Brazil. We know about the United States government. It was completely the United States, involvement in Brazil, just like their support in Argentina and Uruguay. All three are very clear. The U.S. government used sadistic torture, anti-Hispanic, brutal torture by the U.S. gun violent gangster butchers, the racist, murderous butchers and gun violent thugs of the U.S. government, included racist Hispanic torture, their fetish, the U.S. Congress's fetish of the United States government, and their vicious campaign and torture. And we talked about President Carter. Of course, President Carter always causes human rights cries against the Brazilian dictatorship, human rights cries by President Carter, to no avail. It's their own CIA, their racist internal organization, the CIA, the murderous butchers of the U.S. government, are responsible for the mass murder in Latin America. All of the three dictatorships, Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay, that we have discussed, it was the U.S. government, racist, gun violent, murderous butchers that were responsible for all the disappearances. We talked about all the disappearances. We also talked about the economy. What was the economy as a result of the U.S., gun violent, murderous butchers? The economy was terrible. They, basically had no money. All of the dictatorships ended up going into huge debts. They signed IMF agreements that sold out their company to, country to basically foreign capital. Foreign capital took over, and that was the story. The people's income inequality was completely, 100%. The poor people were huge numbers. The rich people were very small, and there was no improvement in terms of social progress, no medical care, no, social improvement, no food, no, exports. Beef was controlled by American capitalist countries. All of these things, these, crops and agribusiness were all controlled by America. The oil, we know the oil companies were all controlled by America. The racist, murderous butchers of the U.S. government. And then finally we talked, so General Medici was in Brazil, and then he continued and meant Figueiredo was the next president. And then finally, Jose Sarney came to power, which followed the, Figueiredo was, popular person. He was democratic, and then finally finished. And then we go to Uruguay. The imperialist American government was a United States functionary in Brazil. Brazil was a United States functionary, and, they had, worked against João Goulart, the Democratic leader, the American racist, murderous, torture, anti-Hispanic butchers of the U.S. government. Uruguay and its internal war, we've talked about Jorge Pacheco. He was the first country's president, military dictator, moved to, Bordaberry, Jose Maria Bordaberry, another, National Party candidate, another military dictator. He was, highly repressive. He could, basically, suspended all democratic institutions, murdered the press, all of which were U.S. government. We read here, as in the rest of Latin America, the Uruguayan military and security forces received training and were aided by advisors of the United States. This had been Mitrion's mission, Dan Mitrion, the Uruguayan person, the racist, murderous butcher of Washington, finishing up. So let's go to Chile, the military takeover over the final, 10, it's about 10 pages, 10 to 12 pages. Because of the strong democratic tradition, Chile did not experience the political and social violence that plagued the rest of Latin America during the 1960s and early 1970s. It was a veritable paradise of tolerance. The socialist and communist parties were able to carry it out on the recruiting activities and encountered no obstacles in putting their candidates up for election. Those persecuted by the dictatorships found refuge there, but the anti-communist hysteria unleashed by Washington in response to the Cuban Revolution reached as far as the southern climes. The Kennedy administration feared victory by the socialist candidate Salvador Allende in the presidential election to be held in September 1964. The Chilean right and the United States transnational corporations with branches in the country shared this fear, and they fed on each other. A plot against Allende, sponsored by the Christian Democratic Party, was set into motion. Its candidate, Eduardo Frei, launched a tough and well-financed campaign $2.6 million, half from the CIA of the U.S. government, portraying Allende as a danger to Chile and all of Latin America. His government, it warned, would be Cuban style, and communism and subversion would spread throughout the continent in a domino effect. In 1963, the CIA began to offer money to political leaders, democratic forces, parties from center and the right, newspapers and journalists, and individuals it considered quote unquote useful to the cause. According to William Colby, chief of operations in the CIA, Nixon named him director in 1973. The Pulitzer Prize winning American journalist Thomas Powers wrote that Chile received more aid per capita from the United States during these years than any other country except Vietnam, but that these sums, generously distributed by the CIA, seldom achieved the desired results. He commented that some political quote-unquote beneficiaries of the CIA thought of that agency as their private bank. Kennedy wanted to strengthen Chile and to show it off as a model of democratic development as opposed to the Cuban communist model. He stimulated investment by tycoons, Rockefeller's family among them, and gave the CIA the green light to block Allende's candidacy. The CIA orchestrated an impressive campaign against Cuba, communism, and Allende and his Socialist Workers' Party, describing it as Stalinist and supported by Soviet funds. In 1964, posters began to appear in Santiago showing Soviet tanks in the streets of Budapest and executions by Cuban firing squads. The idea was to terrorize the Chilean people. If they elected Allende, the same thing would happen to them. Frey won the election with a comfortable margin, and the CIA got what it wanted. The electorate was polarized to Frey's benefit, and the movements of the left were split. In 1965, a scandal broke out when Alvaro Bunster, Secretary General of the University of Chile, denounced a Pentagon plan to carry out a socio-scientific investigation in Chile, funded with millions of dollars and camouflaged by a contract between the University of Chile and American University in Washington. Named the Camelot Project, its goal was to measure the potential for subversion in Latin America and design counterinsurgent policies for the continent. Chilean media and columnists condemned this plan as undue intervention in their country's internal affairs. The international community of sociologists called it a classic case of intervention and espionage with clear political objectives. The uproar in Chile forced the Pentagon to cancel the plan. It had not consulted with the Department of State or informed the ambassador. When Richard Nixon arrived in the White House in January 1969, the Latin American situation had grown much more explosive and complex than during his 1958 goodwill visit, when he was welcomed in Caracas and Lima with stones and rotten eggs. In the 1970s, most of the continent was under military dictatorships and engaged in war against Marxist-Leninist armed movements. The most powerful were those in the Southern Cone. In Panama and Peru, General Torrijos and Velasco Alvarado, both with leftist and anti-American leanings, caused him problems. Panama sought support in the United Nations and the OAS to take over the canal and reestablish sovereignty over the zone. The Peruvian generals are nationalizing the transnational companies in their country, and in democratic Chile, the Congress was debating Chileanizing the copper industry, Chile's principal product, which was in the hands of the American multinationals Anaconda Copper and Kennecott. Frey announced that he was prepared to carry out the promised nationalization gradually. Cuba was another problem. In spite of the United States' attempts to isolate the island, several countries reestablished relations during the 1970s and reopened their embassies in Havana. Still, Cuba did not cause him to lose sleep, since his priorities in foreign policy were the great power of the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China. Nixon's policies towards Latin America, on the advice of Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, were to keep a low profile. It was not a region of primary importance. Nixon's experiences on the continent had not been pleasant, and as Kissinger explained to Chilean embassy officials in Washington in 1969, I am not interested in, nor do I know anything about, the southern portion of the world from the Pyrenees on down. In spite of the supposed lack of interest, Nixon and Kissinger kept their eyes on Chile. They wanted to prevent Allende from winning, and their intervention was thorough. The United States could not stand by and watch this country, quote, went communist because of the responsibility of its own people, remarked Kissinger. He saw Allende as a threat to the continent and claimed that Chile was more dangerous than Cuba since it had a greater capacity to undermine other nations and support insurgency, and the communist ideology would get timely Soviet support. In 1969, rumors of a coup, a phenomenon unknown in Chile, began to circulate. Brigadier General Roberto Vaugh, the commander of a tiny regiment in Tacna, led an uprising, according to secret ITD documents published by Jack Anderson in the Washington Post. In 1972, Vaugh prepared preventive coup to stop Allende's candidacy with the direct advice of the CIA. The Tacnazo was brought under control, but it showed that there were divisions within the armed forces and politicization of some sectors, another phenomenon unknown in Chile. In January 1970, the presidential campaign began in an atmosphere of unrest and political and social aggressiveness. Vaugh continued to make statements hinting at a coup. He accused Frey of disgoverning and the Congress of anarchy and demanded a strong leader in political, economic, and social reforms. General Rene Schneider, commander-in-chief of the army, condemned the coup attempts. Our doctrine and our mission, he remarked, is to support and respect the Constitution. Allende of the MIR and Jorge Alessandri of the Christian Democrats were the principal candidates. A conspiracy orchestrated by the transnational ITT and the CIA was mounted against Allende's candidacy. The conspirators tried to foment a coup by bribing military officers. The United States ambassador Edward Corey was authorized to contact them. Washington, in turn, took measures to stifle the Chilean economy. After the coup they were preparing, Frey would go into exile and return after 6 months when everything would have returned to normal, and again announce his candidacy for the presidency and be supported by all democratic forces, quote unquote. In May 1972, rightist military coups, one led by Vaugh from retirement and the other by General Camilo Valenzuela, decided to kidnap General Schneider, the greatest obstacle in their plans for the coup. They made the attempt on October 22nd. Schneider resisted and was severely wounded. 3 days later, he died in the hospital. 5 of the attackers, young rightists from prominent families, fled the country. Frey decreed a state of emergency. The CIA had contacts with both the conspiratorial groups, according to Colby, a former director of the CIA. It had supplied them with weapons, but had not taken part in the action. Frey named General Carlos Prats commander-in-chief of the army to replace Schneider. As a large public rally in September, Allende referred to the plots being hatched to destabilize the country. He spoke of bribes given to members of the armed forces and mentioned the intention to create economic chaos. He announced that the people would oppose the plans with a national strike. Salvador Allende won the elections of September 4th, 1970 with 36% of the vote, 39,000 more votes than Alessandri, but he did not win the necessary majority. The Congress would have to choose which of the two would be president. Political maneuvers to prevent the Congress from confirming Allende began at once. The CIA, the United States Embassy, United States transnationals, especially ITT, and Chilean politicians in economic sectors took part, announcing that the military coup would be supported by Washington. Jorge Edwards of the Chilean oligarchy, the director and owner of the influential daily El Mercurio, went to Washington to arrange for United States intervention. On November 4th, in an atmosphere of extreme tension, the Congress confirmed Allende and he became president from 1970 to 1973. But before confirming him, it imposed on him the statute of constitutional guarantees, a demand by the Christian Democrats to keep him from communizing Chile. At a rally the following day in Santiago's National Stadium, Allende spoke of a socialist road to development for Chile, of ending its dependency and of initiating relations with the People's Republic of China and reestablishing them with Cuba. Allende, Allende cautiously but firmly began to expropriate powerful national and foreign monopolies and large estates and to buy shares in the principal banks, two of them United States institutions. The Congress unanimously approved the nationalization of copper production. The United States responded with measures intended to destroy the Chilean economy. It suspended aid from the Export-Import Bank and aid and closed off credits from the IMF, the World Bank, and the Inter-American Development Bank, all institutions controlled by Washington. These measures resulted in the flight of national and foreign capital. Allende spoke of a secret blockade, quote unquote, against his government. Allende invited Fidel Castro to visit Chile. He arrived in November 1971 and stayed nearly a month. His presence infuriated the Chilean right and the military. They accused him of interfering in the nation's internal affairs. In his speeches, Fidel characterized the opposition as fascist and the program of worker self-management proposed by the Christian Democrats as criminal demagoguery. He declared that Chile and Cuba were moving towards socialism along different roads, but that their aims were the same. The economic policies of Allende's socialist government met with great success in the first year. They lowered the inflation rate, reduced unemployment, raised wages, froze the price of basic necessities, and increased production. But soon they began to deteriorate. Inflation rose, the price of copper on foreign markets fell, and imports and reserves dropped, largely a result of U.S. manipulation. Chile successfully renegotiated part of its foreign debt and found new markets for its copper, but the situation quickly worsened. Sabotage, food hoarding to produce scarcity, monetary speculation, black market dollars occurred, and there was a succession of work stoppages by truckers, engineers, doctors, and lawyers, all instigated by the CIA. The masses were opposed to these stoppages. To meet this crisis, Allende appointed high-ranking military officers to his cabinet. Sectors of the Chilean right and the United States pressured the military to stage a coup. In November, the plot began to brew. Thousands of days of Allende's government were in constant conflict with the principal political and economic sectors, the military, the transnationals, and Washington. He was forced to deal with strikes by different sectors and had to dodge political opposition in the Congress. To seek solutions, he held conversations with the political parties and made more than 10 changes in his cabinet. In one of the last, he named as ministered the commanders of the three military branches and the police. He called it the National Security Cabinet. There was a wave of repression, which he was powerless to stop. Under the weapons control law, the army leveled factories and workers' homes and repressed the left. Even though Kissinger said that after Allende's election in Chile was not a major preoccupation of the United States, it was to the extent that Nixon personally authorized the CIA to blockade Allende's government. He was convinced that Chile was going down the Cuban road and that the revolution would spread to the rest of the continent. The United States Congress and the transnationals backed him and thought likewise. The Pentagon maintained contact with the Chilean military and continued to provide it with weapons, and the CIA kept on fomenting a coup. It distributed some $6 million among the opposition parties, newspapers, radio stations, unions, and professional associations, and it supported the strikers. Without CIA funds, there would not have been so many strikes, nor would they have lasted so long. The anti-communist ideologic component proved extremely effective in polarizing political forces and splintering the leftist movements. The coup began to gain strength on August 20th, 1973, with a crisis within the armed forces. General Cesar Ruiz, commander of the Air Force and Minister of Public Works and Transportation, whose responsibility it was to put an end to a prolonged trucker strike, resigned from the ministry, and Allende asked for his resignation as commander. When he refused, General Prats, the Minister of Defense, threatened to take control of the Air Force. Hundreds of officers' wives protested in solidarity with General Ruiz in front of Pratt's residence and delivered a letter to his wife calling for his resignation. The police came in to break up the demonstration, spraying tear gas at the people. Prats asked for a declaration of support from the generals. They refused to give it to him. Furious, he resigned from the Ministry of Defense and command of the army. Allende named General Augusto Pinochet in his place. Pinochet was surprised because he was not, as he himself said, among the generals with whom the president was friendly. The offensive against the president continued until September 11th, 1973, the day of the coup. The opposition in Congress attempted to impeach him. One deputy accused him of dictatorial actions and demanded that the military ministers put an end to all the de facto situations that violated the Constitution. A broad majority, 81-41, supported Allende. Allende continued to talk to the Christian Democrats and proposed that a plebiscite decide whether he should remain president or resign. Meanwhile, the trucker strike continued. The military demanded changes in the cabinet. There were street demonstrations for and against the president, and the economic crisis grew more severe. The Christian Democratic Party demanded that the Congress and the president resign and that new elections be held. It was very late for Allende to negotiate a democratic and constitutional solution. In the midst of the crisis, the Chilean and United States navies held joint military maneuvers titled Unitas off Chile's coast. The action was an act of harassment against the Chilean government. On September 11th at 6 a.m., Allende was informed that the naval forces had taken Valparaiso. At 8:30 a.m., Radio Agricultural, an anti-Allende station, announced the coup had begun. At 9 a.m., Allende briefly appeared on the balcony of La Moneda Palace, and half an hour later, he delivered his dramatic last message over the radio. He said that he refused to resign and that would repay the Chilean people loyalty with his life so that he would serve as a lesson in this ignominious history to those who resort to force instead of no reason. The palace was surrounded by tanks. At 11:55 a.m., the Air Force bombed it. La Moneda was in flames. At 1:30 p.m., the palace personnel left. A doctor reported that he had seen Allende shoot himself with a machine gun he was holding his knees, though this was not confirmed. He was buried in his family's mausoleum in Vina del Mar. And Pinochet. On September 11, 1973, Chilean democracy succumbed in a military coup led by General Augusto Pinochet. It was a tragedy for its people and for Latin America because Chile had been a paradigm of civility and democracy. After the Air Force bombed La Moneda, the military took over the city like an army of occupation. Pinochet came to power stained with the blood of the people. With Pinochet began one of the most brutal repressions the continent had ever witnessed. The jail filled with political prisoners and the streets were strewn with the dead. Amnesty International estimated that no fewer than 45,000 people were arrested in the first few days and thousands were killed by the army. Some people succeeded in taking refuge in embassies. Approximately 800 political refugees requested protection from the United Nations and the Chilean church, and many were expelled from the country. After 2 weeks, the military decreed a state of war. Under the Code of Military Justice in time of war, it abrogated civil liberties and gave the police a free hand to detain, interrogate, judge, and execute Allendeists and leftists, and it instituted torture, prohibited by Chilean law, and extrajudicial execution. Pro-Allende media outlets were closed and their directors were assassinated and forced into exiles. The parties of popular unity, Allende's governing coalition, were outlawed and their members were arrested. The Centro Única de Trabajadores, CUT, the only workers' central, was declared illegal and the rights to strike and associate were canceled. From this point on, political crimes were the concern of military tribunals. Confessions obtained under torture were admissible evidence. International human rights organizations, national and foreign journalists, The Chilean Catholic Church, lawyers, diplomats, and victims' relatives began to investigate, document, and denounce the regime's human rights violations. Consternation of what was happening in Chile spread throughout the world. Within a month, delegations of the International Human Rights Federation and the International Movement of Catholic Jurists arrived, followed a few weeks later by a delegation from Amnesty International. Each reported the tragedy the Chilean people were suffering under military repression. The Santiago Stadium was turned into a concentration and death camp. Thousands of people were executed there, among them the famous singer and guitarist Victor Jara, whose corpse was found riddled with bullets, mutilated, and with its hands amputated. This crime was a turning point for the world. Henceforward, the national and international clamor against the butchery grew. Chilean Cardinal Raul Silva Henriquez became the strongest voice of protest against the repression. Catholic Church documents reveal the existence of 17 detention centers where death by torture was daily fare. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights of the OAS also reported on the physical and psychological torture of prisoners, the sadism of the executors of the repression, and the torturers alarmed the world. At the end of 1973, the junta created the National Intelligence Directorate, DINA, under Pinochet's direct control, with hundreds of agents from the three military branches and the police, as well as civilians contracted by the government. The Directorio installed clandestine detention centers and a fleet of unregistered vehicles. DINA was the backbone of the military's regime's repressive forces. 2 months after Pinochet's coup, DINA's head, Colonel Manuel Contreras, along with the heads of security services of Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, Paraguay, and Bolivia, set up Operation Condor, quote unquote, a network of intelligence to operate around the world, centralized in DINA. Teams of agents cooperated in conspiracy plots to capture, interrogate, torture, and murder their political opponents. The Chilean General Prats and his wife were assassinated in Buenos Aires, as was Bernardo Leighton in Rome, Orlando Letelier in Washington, D.C., former president of Bolivia, General Juan Jose Torres, and two congressmen from Uruguay were murdered in Buenos Aires. Pinochet grasped permanent power, as he stated in the Declaration of Principles of the Chilean government, published in March 1974. He set no limits to his term because his job, he claimed, was to achieve the moral, institutional, and material construction of the country, the task that demanded profound and prolonged action. Changing the Chilean mentality was an imperative, he assured his audience. He declared that elections be held in an opportune time, and that the armed forces would not be idle when it came to choosing the next government. There would be a new constitution to safeguard national security and guarantee the armed forces' participation in the government. Pinochet promulgated the so-called governing junta statute. The government was to remain in the hands of the armed forces and the power in the hands of the president and the junta. According to this statute, the order of things might be changed only if the commander-in-chief of the army, Pinochet, ceased to be president of the junta by reason of death, resignation, or total incapacity. In other words, Pinochet, who is now the supreme chief of the nation, would not be able to be removed from office. The cabinet was composed of 6 generals. 6 months after this statute was decreed, Pinochet introduced a tremendously significant change. By a new decree, he would no longer be supreme leader of the nation, but president of the republic, with full powers, and the junta would remain under his control. He began to distance himself from other members of the junta so that there would be no doubt within the government or outside it that he was the sole power. The matter of the anti-communist ideology, the apparent motive for the coup, was defined in the document National Objective of the Chilean Government based on national security and neoliberal economics. Presidential messages, legal dispositions, and institutional acts 2, 3, and 4 indicated that the government's theme was counterinsurgency. It characterized Marxism as the enemy and a perverse doctrine in the service of Soviet imperialism. The government's job was to abolish it. The junta's economic policy, neoliberal and monetarist, were managed by a team called the Chicago Boys. In the first year, it reduced the annual rate of inflation from 600% to 350%. People in Chile and abroad spoke of the Chilean miracle, but at the end of 1974, the prices of basic necessities rose. Inflation set in, and the country was in an economic crisis. In April, the Chicago Boys took over the ministries of finance and economics and the presidency of the central bank. In 1975, production dropped 13%, and the recession was catastrophic. Hundreds of industries were paralyzed. Public investment decreased by 50%. Annual inflation stood at 343%, and unemployment rose to 20%. But in 1977, the boom times of the Chilean miracle, quote unquote, began. The annual growth rate was 9.9%, a rate that continued in 1978 and 1979. The Chicago Boys promised a growth rate similar to that of European countries and the Asian tigers of Taiwan, Singapore, and South Korea. The world was astonished by this quote-unquote miracle, and many in Chile and abroad felt that the brutal repression was justified since it brought progress. But the Washington, D.C. assassination of Orlando Letelier, Allende's former chancellor, and his assistant Ronnie Moffett, a young American woman, catapulted them back to reality. Pinochet's regime was one of the continent's most brutal. Letelier's assassination elicited international disapproval. The FBI and other American agencies pointed at Dina, its Director General Manuel Contreras Sepulveda, and other military officers as the perpetrators of this crime. Washington demanded the extradition of Contreras, but the Chilean government and Court of Justice refused. With the arrival of Jimmy Carter in the White House in January 1977, Chile's relations with the United States became more complicated for Pinochet. Carter pressured the junta to stop violating human rights and political rights, impose sanctions, and tighten them when Chile refused to extradite Contreras. In a speech in Charachilas in July 1977, Pinochet spoke of democratization for the first time and proposed a three-stage program. The armed forces would gradually leave the government, though they would not relinquish power. The process would conclude in 1991 with total democracy. In August, motivated by Undersecretary of State for Latin American Affairs Terence Todman's visit to Chile, the junta dissolved DINA and created the Centro Nacional Informaciones National Information Center, CNI, in its place. It was the same animal with a new name. Its purpose was to relieve international pressure and ingratiate Chile with Washington. Pinochet continued investing himself with new titles and functions and exalting his own authority. Now, in addition to president, he was generalissimo of the armed forces and forces of order. The Chilean regime's criminal record did not diminish the enthusiasm, national and foreign economic sectors for the quote-unquote miracle. Did not diminish the enthusiasm of national and foreign economic sectors for the quote-unquote miracle. Many Chileans reclaimed their properties expropriated by Allende and benefited from the government's economic policies. The transnationals returned. But the quote-unquote miracle had a hidden face. It produced an accelerated concentration of wealth and the economic opening and low tariffs caused by imports to rise disproportionately and weaken national industries. Many small and medium-sized businesses went bankrupt. The cuts in government spending raised unemployment among professionals and white-collar workers, while the salaries of the military rose generously. Foreign bank loans to the private sector for investment in industry were used to purchase shares, business ventures with the state, and weak businesses. The economic empires did not help investment, particularly low during these years. A high percentage of the loans made to the government by international and private banks went toward the purchase of arms. With these policies, the rich, 5% of the population, grew richer and the poor grew poorer. Infant mortality increased dramatically. By the end of 1980, the Chilean foreign debt stood at $1.82 billion in 1977. It was $481 million. But Chile showed off its prosperity. The peso had been revalued. The upper and middle classes traveled the world. The markets were filled with foreign luxury goods, and the relations of the government and the private sector with international financial institutions and foreign investors were excellent. Quote, God placed me in power. But buoyed by the economy, Pinochet called a national plebiscite to approve the new constitution, the text of which was written by a commission appointed by the junta with no participation by independent jurists. Authoritarian and anti-democratic, it included acts and decrees by the junta that curtailed civil liberties, all previously approved by Congress and the military junta. The plebiscite, with a vote limited to yes or no, was held on September 11th, 1980, with the 7th anniversary of the coup. It was held under a state of emergency decreed a month earlier, with all political parties proscribed, without electoral lists, on transparent paper that allowed officials to monitor the voting and the entire process supervised only by government functionaries. According to official data, the result was 67% in favor of the new constitution and 30% opposed to it. The new constitution institutionalized the prolongation of Pinochet's term in 1989, 8 more years, and left open the possibility of his re-election. It created the National Security Council, the government's highest agency, in which the 3 branches of the military were represented by their commanders, and the officers had the right of veto. The plebiscite was denounced as a fraud in Chile and abroad. The process had been totally controlled by the government with no supervision by the opposition, and it was not the free expression of the people's will because Chile was not a free country. Pinochet's voracious appetite for power imposed a new constitutional order that gave him absolute power. But not all was euphoria with the junta, since the miracle was beginning to fade. Its prosperity did not reflect economic recovery. Investments had not been in productive sectors, and many industries were crumbling. There was an economic recession and a profound crisis in the banking and financial systems. Foreign debt was enormous, and the debt accumulated by the private sector and the financial conglomerates, more than $4 billion granted without government guarantees, could not be paid off. The crisis grew more severe, and in November 1981, the government was forced to take control of 4 banks and 4 financial institutions that were on the verge of bankruptcy. It took over 17 more between 1981 and 1983 to keep the banking system from collapsing and pulling the rest of the economy down with it. The Chicago Boys' neoliberal economic policy ended yet another economy controlled by the state. The industrial situation was just as dramatic. Collapses, suspension of loan payments, and massive layoffs. The economic crisis had given birth to a greater political and social crisis. During the first half of 1983, unemployment, including subsidized employment, rose to 34% and 50% among the poorest sectors. The lower classes were reduced to abject poverty. The situation led to protests by upper and middle class housewives. They took to the streets, beating on empty pans. The people and the weakened unions began to confront the dictatorship in demonstrations and strikes, and the political parties formed moderate opposition movements. The Christian Democratic Party, the most active during the dictatorship's hardest years, formed the Alliance Democratica, Democratic Alliance AD, with 5 other parties from the right, the center, and the left. The Communist Party, which was excluded from this alliance, created the Movement Democratico Popular Democratic Movement, MDP, and the MIR, the part of the Socialist Party, led by the former Allende minister, Clodomiro Almeida, and with the other leftist parties and movements. Some of these favored armed struggle against the dictatorship. Pinochet named Sergio Onofre Jarpa of the extreme right as his Minister of the Interior. He was the first civilian to hold his post under the dictatorship. Pinochet persuaded him to start negotiating with the democratic opposition. A civilian protest began in May 1983 with a march of the pots and pans and continued with June demonstration called by Copper Workers Union to protest the arrest of its leader, Rodolfo Seguel. Another strike followed in July after the arrest of Gabriela Valdez, the Minister of Foreign Affairs under Frey. All these protests were quashed by the police, leaving many dead and wounded and hundreds arrested. The government decreed a curfew. During another protest in August, Pinochet announced that 18,000 soldiers would occupy the capital with orders to proceed harshly. The repression was widespread. According to official documents, 9 were killed and 100 arrested in clashes with police. According to the left, the dead numbered 80. The demonstrations continued sporadically and with increasing less participation from the middle and upper classes. These were the more and more students and lower class demonstrators. On the other hand, there were more and more students and lower class demonstrators. In November 1984, the government declared a state of siege, and under the pretext of the curfew, troops raided homes in the working class quarters in the middle of the night. They went from house to house, arresting all the men older than 15. The people were terrorized, and the protests failed. With Santiago's Archbishop Monsignor Juan Francisco Fresna as mediator, JARPA began negotiations with the AD that proved futile and were discontinued. Pinochet declared that while the conversations might lead to agreements, he would never make concessions. In another protest in March 1984, the first armed movement against the dictatorship, the Manuel Rodriguez Popular Front, FPMR, planted bombs in the subway, attacked trains and buses, and assassinated soldiers and policemen. It claimed responsibility for the 1986 kidnapping of Colonel Mario Caibari and the 1987 kidnapping of Lieutenant Colonel Carlos Carreño. It destroyed high-voltage electrical towers, which left vast regions of the country without power. The government maintained that the guerrilla movement was the armed branch of the Communist Party. From the street, scenes showed the brutality against the Chilean people by the forces of order were broadcast to the world by foreign television news programs. Such acts of official brutality resulted in international protests against the Chilean regime. The most monstrous crime was the burning of two young protesters arrested by military patrols in Santiago in July 1986. They were doused with paraffin and set afire. The young man died and the young woman's face was disfigured. Of the 25 military personnel indicated for this crime, only one lieutenant was convinced of quasi-homicide and released on bail. The protest demonstration in response was put down with the regime's accustomed brutality. In August 1986, the government declared that it had found a powerful arsenal on Chile's north coast and claimed that it had brought in with Cuban and Soviet aid. It showed 3,000 captured weapons. Many doubted the truth of this claim, but the government covered itself with a declaration by United States State Department spokesman Bruce Ammerman, who claimed that the weapons were destined for the FPMR and that evidence implicating foreign terrorist groups had been found. Relations between Pinochet and Reagan's government remained excellent. The following month, in September 1986, there was an attempt on Pinochet's life. He was not injured, but several of his bodyguards were killed. This was the first attempt on the life of a president in Chile's history. The government declared a state of siege and responded with an unprecedented wave of repression. Clandestine military groups brutally assassinated 4 activists whom they had dragged out of their homes. The weapons incident and the attempts on his life made Pinochet strengthen himself within the armed forces and with his followers from conservative sectors and the moderate opposition of the AD parties. A few days later, on September 11th, the 13th anniversary of the coup, there was a massive demonstration in support of Pinochet. Opposition sectors claimed that it was organized by the government to launch Pinochet's presidential candidacy. The same 2 incidents also allowed Pinochet to increase the repression, claiming threats to internal stability. On September 21st, he announced a new anti-terrorist law, harsher than the previous laws. In October, he reiterated his refusal to negotiate with the opposition. Needing to sweeten his image before the plebiscite on his presidential candidacy, in his end-of-year message, Pinochet announced that he would lift the state of siege, which had lasted 2 years, and would allow some exiles to return. In January 1987, he approved legislation on political parties and their future organization. Marxist parties were prohibited, and in February, he opened election offices. In April this same year, Pope John Paul II visited Chile, the only Latin American country still under military rule. The Catholic Church was not only the regime's toughest critic, but also a major support of the people's struggle against Pinochet. The Vicariate of Solidarity, created by Cardinal Raul Silva Henriquez to support the people in the fight against the repression, published a bulletin that constantly denounced the regime's serious human rights violations. Relations between the church and the government were tense. Pinochet recommended to the bishops that they would be better off sticking to praying. The political connotations of the Pope's visit were feared equally by the church and the people and the regime. His words would be scrutinized, but the Pope, a careful orator, supported the church's struggle. In his homilies, he called for coexistence and an end to the violence, and he condemned physical and moral torture. He visited the National Stadium after the coup. It had become a place of detention, death, and torture, where 90,000 young people awaited him. He kissed the ground and remembered the stadium as a place of suffering. Among the crowds guarded by large police establishments, there were violent confrontations resulting in dead and wounded spectators. When the Pope left Chile in opposition, the opposition gained strength and demanded a return to democracy by way of its free elections. The government fixed the date for the plebiscite. It would take place on October 5th, 1988. God placed me in power, declared Pinochet. The opposition formed the Comando Nacional de No, National Commando for No Vote. Its demonstrations were met with police bullets, and hundreds of people were wounded and arrested. When the junta announced that its candidate was Pinochet, there were massive protest marches and confrontations between the yes and no partisans and between the no's and police. Thousands were arrested and the number of casualties grew. That night, Pinochet appeared on television smiling and dressed in civilian clothes to ask the people's support for a new democracy and to ask them to pardon him for any errors he might have committed. The country's future was at stake in the plebiscite, and the results surprised many. Opinion polls show that the no vote was rising, but there were fears of fraud in Pinochet's favor. The votes came in at 55% no and 43% yes. Although Pinochet was defeated, it was not the end of the dictatorship. The election of the new president would take place in December 1989 and the transfer of power in the following March. Pinochet remained in power for another year and a half in accordance with the constitution approved by fraudulent plebiscite. During this difficult time, the opposition achieved some constitutional reforms in tough negotiations with the government, including that a civilian be appointed to the National Security Council, the highest governing body on which the military held a veto. The reforms were approved by 86% of the vote in a plebiscite. The Communist Party pointed out that the new government remained under the aegis of military superpowers. The opposition trusted that the new regime would reform the Chilean Magna Carta to restore democracy. True democracy. The road to democracy. On December 14, 1989, Christian Democrat Patricia Aylwin, the candidate of coalition of 17 parties, was elected president with 55% of the vote. Hernan Bucci, the official candidate, got 29%. The new parliament was also elected. Aylwin took office in March 1990, declaring Chile will not have democracy overseen by the military, since he explained the armed forces were under civilian control. Nevertheless, Pinochet, commander of the armed forces, was a member of the National Security Council with a lifetime seat in parliament and could not be forced to retire from either of these posts by constitutional mandate. The people demanded that the military officers be tried for human rights violations. They also called for the new government to annul the amnesty law decreed by the junta in 1978, which covered the worst period of the repression, and the new law passed 2 days before the elections that prevented the new parliament from investigating the government functionaries who served during Pinochet's regime. This was the most hotly debated topic of the new democracy. Aylwin asked Pinochet to remain at the margins of political activity and renounce the command of the army, but he refused. Pressured by public demand, Aylwin named the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in March to investigate human rights violations committed during the 17 years of military dictatorship. In spite of the verdict by the Supreme Court in October 1990, upholding the 1970 amnesty law, Aylwin reiterated his readiness to clear up such acts. Forced to put up with Pinochet's arrogance, which was supported by the military establishment and by powerful sectors on the right, they organized a demonstration backing the general and powerless to stop the repression and abuses of the police and the military. Aylwin publicly recognized that there will be justice as long as democratic stability is not put at risk, and that the correlation of the forces it is not favorable to justice. Alwin applauded the people's decisions to transfer Allende's remains from Santa Ana's cemetery to Santiago. It was an act of reparation, stated the president. The ceremony was held on September 4th, 1990. About 9 feet away from his grave, the cornerstone was laid for a new mausoleum to honor those who had died or disappeared under the dictatorship. On September 11th, the anniversary of the coup, there was a demonstration by Pinochet's followers outside his residence to thank him for the government. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission presented its findings to President in January 1991, 2,000 pages in 6 volumes. In March, Alwin made them public. The press called them horrifying. They documented 2,279 murders, most of them summary executions, and 965 disappearances, death by torture at the hands of the state security services. It also brought to light terrorist attempts by DINA, created and dissolved by Pinochet, and implicated it in the assassination of General Carlos Prats and his wife in Buenos Aires, and Allende's former chancellor, Orlando Letelier, in Washington. To Pinochet, such acts were part of the, quote, internal war he waged against subversion. Alwin announced he would not annul the amnesties law, but that keeping it would be not be an outside obstacle to carrying on legal investigations and determining responsibility, especially in cases of disappearances. He begged forgiveness from the relatives of the victims in the name of the entire country, since by act or omission, the whole of society was responsible. He offered them moral and material reparations and announced the creation of an organization that would continue searching for the disappeared and maintain archives on human rights violations. Alwin asked the people and the armed forces to transcend this tragic past. The party's over. At the end of the 1980s, the countries of the Southern Cone, free of dictatorship and insurgent movements, which had virtually eliminated the government, set out on the difficult road of consolidating democracy. Though they left their military establishments intact, no one dared touch them. The military was a threat no longer. Only Pinochet, arrogant, cynical, and pig-headed, continued grasping the props of power he himself had written into the national constitution to perpetuate himself in the Chilean political landscape. His presence in the parliament as senator for life and by constitutional provision, the last expression of his dictatorial will, was an affront to the Chilean people and government and a warping of its democracy. When he appeared in parliament, the popular and democratic sector protest, demanding that Congress revoke his right he had acquired, fraudulently failed. Pinochet would remain a part of the Chilean political scene, perhaps until his last breath. With the exception of Chile, the military dictatorships have left their countries in ruins, with runaway inflation, economic recessions, and huge foreign debts caused mainly by the multi-million-dollar purchases of weapons which were used to kill their own people. This was another matter no civilian government dared to investigate. The new democracy's priority was to solve the economic problems they inherited by the fascist dictatorships. They all opted for neoliberal economic policies, which accentuated the gap between rich and poor. Amid this landscape of great problems and hopes, the colossi of the Southern Cone began this new phase of their history. So again, masters of war, Latin America, and U.S. aggression from the Cuban Revolution through the Clinton years, Clara Nieto. We're going to make some comments on the Chilean dictatorship. So we see that Allende was brought to power. Allende was the democratically elected leader that took power in 1970. United States government, starting under Gerald Ford, and then starting under Richard Nixon, and then subsequently Gerald Ford. Maintained a state of military, racist, murderous butchery. The U.S. government, Richard Nixon, backed a coup in Chile against Allende, and Henry Kissinger, the Secretary of State of the United States, the racist butcher of Washington, furthered this coup. Basically, he said that Chile was not of high profile, but Nixon had already put down his statement that he wanted to overthrow Allende's government. Basically, they went through the process. The CIA went through a huge subversion campaign in Chile. They did all sorts of, handouts of, money. They bribed politicians. They tried to basically bribe military officers. the bribes of Washington to military officers to cause butchery in Chile. The U.S. is responsible for the mass murder of Augusto Pinochet. It is not the Chilean people or the Chilean democracy. It is the Washington government, the United States government, racist, murderous butchers that are responsible for Chilean mass murder and their, imprisonment and Augusto Pinochet's atrocities. So continuing on, the conspiracy, orchestrated by the transnational ITT and the CIA was mounted against Allende's presidency. Allende, was, subverted in the first election in which Free took power. And then afterwards, Allende basically, retook power in 1970. He won 36% of the vote, 39,000 more than Alessandri. But the Congress had to choose one of the two, and basically political maneuvers from Congress was tried by the United States government, including the CIA and United States transnational, especially ITT, which is, ITT was the, organization involved in the subversion. The Chilean politicians and economic sectors, basically wanted to avoid Allende from coming to power. They were unsuccessful, and he took power on November 4th in the setting of extreme tension. We saw, basically the Pentagon had maintained military relationships. Always remember, the U.S. government always maintained their military relationships with the government, military secretly behind the government's back. This is an action that they have performed in Indonesia as well. They did, secretive communications with Brazilian generals as well, Indonesian generals and Chilean generals. And, they were, accused of, basically the Pentagon maintained contact and the CIA kept on fomenting a coup. It distributed $6 million among the opposition parties, cash, newspapers, radio stations, unions, and professional associations, and supported the strikers. Without CIA funds, there would not have been so many strikes, nor would they have been so long. So they basically fomented the coup. And then we talk, Pinochet. Pinochet was pretty horrible. He was a brutal dictator. He was put in there by Washington. Washington sent its military assets to Chile to, engage in a violent takeover. The Navy, started the coup at Valparaiso. The United States government, including the Chilean government, the Chilean military, the Chilean and the United States navies held joint military maneuvers titled United off Chile's coast. The action was a harassment by the United States against the Chilean government. On September 11th at 6 a.m., Allende was told that the naval forces had taken over Valparaiso, and an anti-Allende station at 8:30 a.m. announced a coup. Allende at 9 a.m. briefly appeared on the balcony, and half an hour later, he delivered his dramatic last message over the radio and said he refused to resign and that he would repay the Chilean people's loyalty with his life so that it would serve a lesson in this ignominious history to those who would resort to force instead of reason. The palace was surrounded by tanks, and then the Air Force bombed the palace, and Allende was murdered by the U.S. government, gun-violent thugs. And then Pinochet, years of repression, 1973 to 1989, he was in power. He assassinated so many people. Over 300,000 to 500,000 people were murdered by the U.S. government, fascist butcher, Augusto Pinochet. And, again, we had the, basic process in the United States. You put, Jimmy Carter in and suggest that, Carter's somehow Mr. Human Rights Champion. Mr. Human Rights Champion is an anti-Hispanic butcher racist of, the third world. He's an anti-Hispanic butcher, and we know about his, human rights campaign. But in general, that was a little fanfare, a little kind of, dance around the actual Pinochet regime of mass murder. And then God placed me in power. We read about that God placed him in power. He was basically drunken with power. He had a plebiscite in 1989. Finally, in his plebiscite, he lost the vote, but he was left in power for 1.5 years after that plebiscite and maintained control of Chile and was successful in holding the Chilean people, in a state of racist oppression and subjugation for, 16 years. He was assassinated. He assassinated many people, and finally he was removed from power. I mean, he left office basically. So we reviewed today the four countries of the Southern Cone. We reviewed Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, and Chile, all of whom were aided and abetted by the United States in military dictatorships. They practiced racist, anti-Hispanic torture that were paid for and funded by U.S. government gun-violent butchers, murderous white butchers of the American government. And then finally, the Chilean leader, Augusto Pinochet, was the worst. I mean, according to Nieto, Augusto Pinochet was the worst. He was a dictator. He was mass murderer, torturer, and did all sorts of subversion, repression in Chile. So again, I recommend you download the book at the book link, Masters of War, Latin America and U.S. Aggression. I'll be back tomorrow with the next chapter. I think it'll be half Reagan's Wars. So we discussed the racist white American anti-Hispanic butchers with a fetish for Latin American torture that kept the people of Latin America in a state of abject poverty. With highly repressive and dictatorial non-democratic governments that murdered frequently and failed completely in improving the social conditions and well-beings of the Latin American masses. The racist whites of Washington gave free torture technology to the military dictatorships in Latin America to provide them with hardware to torture Hispanics against the country's laws. The U.S. white racist government has a fetish for Hispanic torture and displayed wholeheartedly during the national security doctrine in Latin American dictatorships, which has been widely documented. They supplied electrocution and drowning hardware, as well as amputation machetes and all sorts of torture paraphernalia that the racist white murderous butchers of the United States used to enforce racist subjugation and oppression in their colonized lands of Latin America. The murderous racist butchers deny their supply of torture technology and their fetish for Hispanic torture, but it is well documented and clear in numerous studies by scholars. We discussed Cuba and the racist white murderous American butchers, pro-South African attack on Angola and enslavement of African blacks. We also discussed Cuba's victory, called Playa Africa. We also discussed the United States' relations with Cuba and the murderous butcher of National Security Advisor of Carter, Brzezinski, who fabricated evidence. Finally, we talked to the Mariel boat people who were encouraged to come by the United States by Carter, but when they arrived, they were tortured and imprisoned in INS prisons, and many were murdered. This is the typical action of the racist white American butchers, anti-Hispanic butchers, with a fetish for torture and racist, anti-black, and anti-Hispanic murderers. So again, Krishna Iyer with the Iyer Think Tank in Delray Beach. I'm glad you could join us. Please join me tomorrow for the next podcast. Have a great day.